Hello, and welcome to the Wilson Center. Thank you. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm Becca Pincus, Director of the Polar Institute at the Wilson Center. As you know, the Wilson Center is the nation's foremost nonpartisan policy think tank for tackling global issues through open dialogue. And our event today will certainly advance Arctic policymaking. We are honored to be joined by Senator Murkowski and our distinguished guests to mark an important day, the public release of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission report on Goals and Objectives for Arctic Research 2023 to 2024. I'd like to congratulate Dr. Mike Sfraga, Chair of the Arctic Research Commission, as well as the 7 commissioners and the staff. This report is a major accomplishment that will guide U.S. Arctic research efforts for years to come. The report establishes research priorities and goals that, when achieved, will inform decision makers in Congress and across the interagency and advance U.S. national objectives in the Arctic region. It's now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sfraga to the stage. As you are all aware, Mike was just named President Biden's nominee as the first ever ambassador at large for Arctic affairs. We are all so proud and honored to have him here today with us, and wish him a speedy confirmation. Mike.
Thank you, Dr. Pincus, for those very kind remarks. And thank you, friends, for joining us today. And on behalf of the commissioners, let me tell you that it has been a pleasure to work on the report that we have completed. It's been a passion, a sense of urgency on behalf of these commissioners, and you will hear from them later on today. And on behalf of the commissioners, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral lands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make this their home today. I want to thank Senator Murkowski for her leadership on all things Arctic. Yes, Alaska, but as you know, she truly is our Arctic ambassador. Senator Murkowski, thank you for being with us today. I also want to thank Ambassador Mark Green. He has been supportive from day one of the Polar Institute, the work of the Arctic and the Antarctic, and of all of us in this room. Ambassador Green, thank you for embracing what others thought was a stretch. You have embraced it. It is no longer a stretch. You have made it a core foundational program within the center, within Washington, D.C., within the country, and throughout the world. Thank you, Mark. One more critical thank you. We're joined here today by Catherine Stevens. Catherine, where are you? Catherine Stevens. Catherine and Ted Stevens have an enduring legacy. In my home state of Alaska, they have created a place that I love. They have advanced us in ways we could not have imagined. If you ever had envisioned a couple together advancing anything, you would have a photo of Catherine and Ted Stevens. Not because they were looking for political chits, not because they were looking for power and influence. They truly were looking to build a state. Catherine, thank you for everything you have done for all of us. But one of the enduring legacies is a brand new DoD center, the Ted Stevens Center in Anchorage, Alaska. No better place to have the Ted Stevens Center for Arctic Studies than in Anchorage, Alaska. That yet is one more enduring legacy of the Stevens family. And we thank you, Catherine, for embracing that very important center. So, the Arctic Research Commission was established in 1984 and amended in 1985. We are an independent federal agency. Our job is to advise the President of the United States and Congress on both domestic and international Arctic research and applicable policies. The Arctic Research Policy Act that established the Commission also established the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee. In the Act, it says, quote, the United States Arctic Research Commission shall develop and recommend integrated national Arctic research policy and assist in establishing a national Arctic research program planned to implement that policy. The work will be done with its sister agency, IARPC, as I noted, in helping to craft a 5-year Arctic research plan. You'll hear more about that later. There are 7 presidentially appointed commissioners. The composition of the commission influences our work. 7 highly qualified Arctic experts. 5 of the 7 are Alaskans. 4 of the 7 are women. 3 of the 4 are Alaska Native leaders. You can imagine the lens through which we have explored what the research priorities are for the United States. You will see that unfold before you today. We have 5 core duties: to develop a national Arctic research policy, to facilitate Arctic research coordination, to review federal Arctic research programs, to recommend improvements for data sharing, and to facilitate cooperation with Alaska and international researchers. The 2023-2024 Goals Report is a result of 1 year of work by these commissioners. Lots of email, lots of phone calls, some spirited discussions, but always supportive results. There have been key policy drivers that have guided our work. A lot of you in this audience were called by us. We've read your paperwork. We've read your research. We've read your findings and recommendations. We've gone back years. We've looked forward decades. All have coalesced in this goals report. We have key drivers that we did look at, in addition to all of your work. The national strategy for the Arctic region, now led by our friend Ambassador Dave Bolton, transitioning to an implementation plan. We looked at that hard as it was growing and evolving, and you hear more from Dave later on. The national security strategy mentions the Arctic. That got our attention as well. The aperture on the Arctic has certainly evolved and grown. We sought guidance from Alaska Federation of Natives, the Inuit Circumpolar Conference, and others. The state of Alaska, the Department of Fish and Game, Natural Resources were all key inputs into our report. The Alaska State Committee for Research updated their newest plan, and we took guidance from them. We also looked at other organizations both throughout the North and elsewhere, all key drivers in our policy development. There were many, many goals, recommendations, and objectives that we looked at. In fact, I think the list at one point was over 50. Can't do 50, can't get 50 in a report, 50 is not doable. But 5 seemed reasonable. So we have 5 key recommendations and goals. Again, none of these will be a surprise to you because you have all written about it, mentioned them, and recommended them. Goal 1, environmental risks and hazards. Important here, I think, is the fact that we've embraced the issue of natural hazards, especially in the North. Volcanoes, earthquakes. Yes, climate change is absolutely a key driver, but we also need to look at what we already have been doing and the need for more work in that area. Remember the composition of this commission. Community health and well-being. Key to this commission. Infrastructure, not just basic infrastructure, in which my home state and the Arctic need, but infrastructure to support research, basic research. Also basic infrastructure, like indoor plumbing, water that you can drink, food sources that are reliable. Arctic economic research. The economics of the Arctic are not something that people go to college and study at the get out. They sort of evolve into this program. We're asking for more economic research, and you'll hear more about that later. And finally, research cooperation. In the past, we've focused on international cooperation, which we will still do. But we need cooperation within the federal family of agencies. We need research cooperation in our own state of Alaska. We need research cooperation throughout our country. So we're looking at research cooperation writ large. But a common theme through all 5 goals is research cooperation and listening to indigenous peoples and indigenous knowledge. We can talk about incorporating or we can incorporate. This report calls for will incorporate, will be guided by, and you'll hear more about that later. We also have a cross-cutting theme, data analytics and informatics. Now, if you're like me and I start reading something that says data analytics and informatics, I might put a ball game on. But it's important because big data is needed. Scenario building, modeling, all needed. You'll see that theme throughout, and you'll hear more about that later. We share a sense of urgency, finally, with many of the efforts that are undergoing as we speak. So our goals report should not be seen as one siloed effort. It should be seen in a broader context. In a broader context brought about by the Department of State, think about a consulate in Nuuk. Think about the last Arctic conference you went to internationally. You see far more presence of the U.S. government there, mostly through the Department of State. The Arctic Executive Steering Committee and the National Security Council leading our national strategy for the Arctic region, and now an implementation plan. Think about the work that Dr. Larry Hinsman does leading IARPIC and their 5-year plan. Think about DoD's Arctic strategies, the Department of Homeland Security, the unique role of the Coast Guard. The Department of Energy just released an Arctic strategy. We have a Ted Stevens Center. Think about the Venn diagram of effort and think about how they all work together. That's how we see the commission, as part of this larger Venn diagram to continue the effort. So let me just talk a little bit about the continuation of these efforts. If you take all those Venn diagrams together to Mike, it feels like a continuation of U.S. efforts in the Arctic region, but at an accelerated pace and an accelerated effort. I think about a continuum of U.S. efforts in the Arctic region. Are we perfect yet? No, but I think we do have a continuation and a continuum. And finally, when you think about that Venn diagram, you're beginning to see continuity in our efforts in the Arctic. We're not there yet, but I think we're evolving in the right place. And we get to the right place because we listen to the right people. One of them is Senator Murkowski. Last year, at a commission meeting, she beamed in from Washington, D.C. I forget what hour, but as you know, I'm not sure the senator runs by a clock. She's always available to us. And she challenged this commission. And Senator, I went back and looked at the transcripts. And frankly, they frightened me. Because you said wonderful things, but boy, did you challenge us. I think we've gone a long way to meet your challenge. Here's what you said to us. And sometimes directly to me, which is the part that made me feel. I think, this is a quote, I think good policy can come from good research because it builds reliable and authentic knowledge. Mike, I'm looking at you as the leader of the commission, and I would really challenge you. Then she spoke to all of the commissioners. Take this commission to another level. And I extend the challenge to all of who are serving on the commission. Build on the foundation that Meade Treadwell and Fran Ulmer, now we all know Meade Treadwell and Fran Ulmer, those are big shoes, and that's a big leadership leap. But she challenged us to build on the foundation that both of them have established, along with all those commissioners that came before you. She also said, Alaskans understand the balance that we have to strike. The North and Alaska are not about one thing. We're about a lot of things at the same time. We're about economic development and environmental conservation. We're about native cultures and traditions, defense, sustainability, and so much more. Every one of these areas has a basic and applied research component. Another quote, I'm putting the challenge out there to all of you to help us accurately and aggressively reflect on our nation's Arctic interests, both domestically and abroad. I'm almost done, Senator. I appreciate what you do. I appreciate your focus, but now that the efforts and the collaboration you will bring to these important discussions are here, they're more important than ever, more important than any other time previously. Your final quote, a lot to put on your shoulders, but I know you have the capacity, and I know I'm looking and know that I'm looking to working with each of you every day to help advance the Arctic. Senator, I think this commission has done wonderful work over the course of the years since you challenged us. I believe we've gone a long way in advancing not just the Arctic research enterprise for the United States, but being part of that broader Venn diagram of effort that you and others have led so valiantly for many decades. With that, please welcome to the podium the senior senator from the state of Alaska, Lisa Murkowski.
Well, Mike, thank you. Thank you for the introduction and for reminding me about that meeting. And I did challenge you because you're comfortable in issuing challenges when you know that those that you're speaking to have the capacity to rise to that, to make that happen. And I'm pleased to be able to stand with you today to share with those who are here and those who are listening online to share this rollout of the goals and objectives for the Arctic Research Commission. It is something that I care about. It's something that I want others to care about. And so the fact that you're sharing a few minutes and later on this afternoon when the commissioners will present, that you're giving this commitment. So thank you. I am just super excited. Really, really feel very encouraged with the nomination this week, the announcement of the first ever nominee to be the United States at-large Arctic ambassador. This is a big job for a key moment, and Mike, there's a lot of folks out there that have Arctic credentials, but I am proud to stand with you. I'm proud to support you. I'm hoping that I'll be able to certainly introduce you before the Foreign Relations Committee when your nomination is taken forward, and to try to move this as quickly as possible. Sometimes when ambassadors are named, there's a little bit of on-the-job training that goes on. There is no necessary training when it comes to Mike Sfraga and an understanding, an in-depth understanding of all things Arctic. And so I'm looking forward with great enthusiasm to when you will be able to wear that hat. But I think about the hat and the role that you have played as chair of the commission here. And truly, thank you and not only your commissioners, but the entire team for where we are today. When you look around the room in terms of who's here, who's listening, I asked yesterday when I met with the commissioners, well, who's going to be there? What's our audience? And it really is. It's all Arctic. It's Ambassador Green, and as Mike has pointed out, your leadership, your enthusiasm with the Polar Institute, Dr. Pincus, you with Mike have turned the Wilson Center into the preeminent Arctic think tanks. And it's a little bit challenging to actually get into this building sometime. And I know I'm not the only one that has been confounded by the doors, but it really has become this Arctic public square. You just have to figure out how you access the public square. But once you get in, I mean, this is where the conversations are happening and have been happening. And so really putting this on the map is something that we talked about some years ago. And now to really be able to call it the preeminent Arctic think tank, I hope you all take great pride in that. Ambassador Balton, Dr. Hinsman, Dr. Ulvestad, Dr. Kreik, Derek Chollet is going to be beaming in by video, but representing the administration, which pleases me to know that increasingly and truly the emphasis that is being placed on the far north is really ramping up. It's really starting to happen on multiple levels. And so that is key to the success out there. But when it comes to this report, I think so much of the credit and the thanks really does go to the 7 members of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. And Mike, you had called out 5 Alaskans, 3 Native women, great representation, great Arctic expertise in each of you. But it shows up in the report. You see that in the report. So I truly commend each of you for the work that you have done, your contributions to it. And you're always kind of a little embarrassed when you listen to the words that you said a year ago or so, and it's like, okay, but I did. I challenge this commission because you're capable of so much, but we need so much to come from this kind of research. We need you. And I challenged the commission to be more visible, to be more engaged, to make sure that more people find out about the good work that goes on. And you're doing exactly that. I had not appreciated or realized, but apparently there has been no public rollout of an Arctic Research Commission report prior to this time, even though this is a commission that has been stood up now since the mid-'80s. And yet this is the first time that there's been kind of the big public push. Why? Not necessarily because we have more to report than we ever have before, although we do have more to report than we ever have before, but because we need to be able to share with an interested country and an interested world what we're doing in this space. People want to know. Where's the source? Where do we go? Well, let's start. Let's start with this. I shared with everybody yesterday. I read through the full report. Believe it or not, I actually get a lot of reports that are delivered to me, and I could pretend and tell you that I read all of them. I do not. Sometimes I just flip through and look at the pictures, look at the table of contents, move to the executive summary. But I read the report, and there is so much that I like. There's so much overlap, certainly with the priorities that I have. But the timely policy drivers and the research priorities, the goals that have been outlined are well formed from the environmental risks and the hazards to communities, the well-being of the people of the North, the economics, the infrastructure. I particularly like the fact that in addition to recommendations, you give us a progress update. You let us know, how are we doing? How are we actually doing? So it's one thing to get a report that says, this is what we think you should do. But when you're tracking that progress, that's important for us. There's some areas that particularly touched me, the emphasis on maternal health, the additional emphasis on indigenous knowledge and how we incorporate that into our scientific research. I think there's some big ideas and recommendations, particularly that we should be considering in how we are expanding our international agreements. These are good, solid things that we can kind of lean into with you. But I think really the highest value to this report is its abiding commitment to Arctic research, to the irreplaceable process of gathering the facts, gathering the data, analyzing them, understanding them, figuring out where our gaps are, and then using them as the tools to make good policy. And we had a conversation about this just yesterday. We're doing so much from a policy perspective. Think about what happened last year, or last Congress, with a bipartisan infrastructure bill. We got a lot of money that's coming north, a lot of investment in infrastructure that is needed and critical. But let's be smart about how we are building out this infrastructure. Let's understand where our science is taking us in terms of areas that are threatened by climate risk. Let's understand more of what we're seeing so that we are building smart into the future, not just building for what we're looking at right now. I'm not a sports analogy fan, but let's figure out how we do skate to the puck. You know, how are we building this out? And I think that's what my dad envisioned when he wrote the legislation that created the Arctic Research Commission nearly 4 decades ago. You know, what's the Arctic going to look like? And I think what we're talking about is it. I think about the experts in all different areas, whether Alaskan Native, collaborating with Alaskans, forming these core goals and priorities, and then using them to inform and improve federal actions or strategies, the plans for the Arctic. We went down, I called it a rabbit trail. Now today I'm going to call a walk down memory lane. I was wandering around in a bookcase in my office this weekend, and this is volume 2 of the Arctic Research of the United States from spring 1988. And I start flipping through, looking at the pictures, looking at the table of contents. But in the back are all of the recaps of the meetings from the Arctic Research Commission. The 11th meeting, September 4th, 1987, kind of giving the update and the recap. I'm here to tell you, that did not captivate me, all right? There's not a single picture there. It's not that it's so simple, but let's just kind of wander through what has been put together. I'm not sure who chose the cover here of the commission's report, but look at it. If you had to sum up the last 20 years of Arctic policy, a picture of an icebreaker who's probably very slowly breaking through this ice, a couple of searchlights trying to poke out through the darkness, that's a pretty good kind of a symbol of the past 20 years. Kind of slow but steady, kind of looking around in the dark. Are we going the right way? Is there a better lead over here? So it's a little bit of a figurative sense, but look at that. Look at how much ice they've broken through. So we're making progress, and it's slow, but it's sure. But the policies and the people that we're putting in place to guide U.S. decision making in an Arctic that is rapidly changing. This is really what it's all about. So I'm excited about where the commission is. I'm excited about the focus on the Arctic. I know it's been hard in this past year to really key in on some of the Arctic policies when the largest Arctic nation abandons its responsibilities, launches a catastrophic war that's almost a full year now. But now Russia is effectively an international pariah, all but shutting down, and I shouldn't say all but shutting down structures like the Arctic Council, because we do know that the working groups have been working. But we all know it has been a challenge at so many different levels. But still, even in the midst and the face of all of that, we're moving forward. Just a quick little laundry list, because you got to do it, because it does actually make me smile. A few of the things that we have done to really step more aggressively into our role as an Arctic nation. One is not enough. One is not enough. One icebreaker does not a fleet make. I think I've said that here at the Wilson Center before, but we've appropriated billions of dollars to invest in Arctic infrastructure, the polar security cutters, the ports, basic water and sanitation, broadband systems, the newly released national strategy for the Arctic region, the reinstated Arctic Executive Steering Committee, which is so important, the revived Department of Energy's Arctic Energy Office, the prompted Arctic-specific strategies from each branch of the military, the reformed 11th Airborne at Eielson, establishing the Ted Stevens Center for the Arctic Securities Studies, and it's so good to see you, Catherine, here. Your interest in the Arctic has never waned, and your support and carrying that forward means so much to us. And then, of course, just this week, nominating our first ever Arctic ambassador. So we've got a lot more to do. On my short list is Mike's confirmation. We also need to codify that position. We've got a measure that we call the Arctic Commitment Act, which takes a comprehensive view of national security, shipping, trade, and research. That one's a little bit more of a heavier lift, if you will. But I think we've got the tool here to help push so much of that, and that's exactly what you do. What you do here at the Commission, you've got a basically a research guide for everything else that we do here. So this report is just the latest effort to help elevate the Arctic in our national consciousness and our policies. I can only hope that it's going to get as much attention as flying objects that seem to favor the Arctic, because this is important stuff. It's something that all of us should be ready and willing to utilize. So thank you again to the commissioners that have made this happen. I've spent longer time than I wanted on this, but you need to know the value of this research and what it's going to do to help us smartly inform policy up there on the Hill. So just thank you for what you do. Okay, you want me to sit in the middle, or where do you want me?
I want wherever you'd like to.
Okay.
In the middle is fine.
All right, I'll sit right here.
We looked at the org chart. You get to sit wherever you'd like. Thank you, Senator, for those remarks. Challenges past and challenges present, and then laying out challenges for the future. Now, my pleasure to introduce the President, CEO, and Director of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Mark Green. You've heard a lot about him today. You know a lot about him, and we've asked him to please spend a little bit of time with the Senator in a question and answer period. Can't think of anybody better to do that than Ambassador Green, a former member of Congress, ambassador to Tanzania, and the administrator of USAID. If you understand the world in the way in which Mark understands the world, the Arctic fits well into your thinking, but you would also be very smart to get some guidance from Mark about the way in which the world should be. Mark, thank you again for your support. Please welcome to the stage Ambassador Mark Green.
So my first reaction is that Mike Schraga understands how things work. He was deferential to senators. That will serve you well as you go through the confirmation process, so be very careful with that. Welcome, and thank you for joining us, and thank you for your leadership. We don't have much time, but I wanted to touch upon a few issues. So you made reference to it. Nothing's going on in Alaska. We've got balloons. We've got Russian warplanes. On a serious level, maybe in a positive way, it reminds us a little bit of the significance of Alaska in our national defenses. You know, we tend not to pay attention until we had to this week. But talk a little bit about the role that Alaska plays in national security.
Well, we are at the front lines. I mean, we really are. We're at the front lines of matters that should get the attention of the rest of the country. And I was a little flip in my observation about the balloons, but the reality is that the threats that we're watching very, very carefully, where are they? It's Russia, it's China. Let's not forget North Korea. So if you want to send a message to the United States about Russia's ability to put aircraft up in the air, we see that, and we respond appropriately and in kind, and do so in a decisive way because of what we have placed there in Alaska, whether it is more fifth-generation fighters than anywhere else in the country, whether it's our long-range discrimination radar, ground-based missile defense, all of the assets that we have out on the Aleutian. We are the eyes and the ears. We are protecting that front line. People don't think about it. And Ambassador, you're absolutely right. Until something actually happens. Well, our role is to try to keep that something from happening. whether it is unidentified flying things or whether it's Russians that are going to kind of come in and show us the underside of their aircraft, whether it is naval ships, Russian and China in formation.
You pointed out the one icebreaker. As we know, Russia has nuclear-powered icebreakers, so they have long seen the importance of this, and we have to respond.
We have to respond, and our ability to respond in an area that is harsh, that is big, that there's a lot of room, there's a lot of ocean out there. Think about the responsibilities of the Coast Guard in really being able to cover an area that most people have no comprehension of the size, much less the size of the mainland itself. So much of this is a little bit of an education. You don't want the education to be when you're sitting in a classified briefing, and I have members who will say, well, I don't understand if this object came down on the ice, why can't they just go out there and get it? And you have to kind of walk them through the fact that it is 50 below up there right now. You have ground blizzard going on. You can't keep aircraft out there for more than a few hours. You can't keep human beings out there for much longer. Somebody actually suggested, well, that if it drops, if we shoot it out of the sky, surely it just goes through the ice and we've lost it. Well, we've got some pretty serious ice up there. So these are not kind of the education opportunities that you want to have, but that's actually what's going on right now.
No, I believe it. Well, and you touched upon this a bit, but it's been a pretty remarkable year for U.S. Arctic policy. You made reference to the administration releasing a new national strategy for the Arctic region, reestablishing the Arctic Executive Steering Committee. You championed, as we've referenced, the Ted Stevens Center. The State Department has reopened a consulate in Greenland. USAID, my old institution, has created a senior development advisor for Greenland. And some guy named Dr. Shrega has been nominated to the Arctic ambassador. It has been a remarkable year, but as you noted, that's just literally the first few steps. We have a long way to go. What do you see as some of the next steps that we should be thinking about and focusing on?
Well, we are still moving far too slow, in my view, with polar security cutters. We had a window where we thought we were going to be able to have access to a commercial icebreaker to help us kind of bridge the gap between where we are right now and until we see the actual polar security cutters come offline. So we have to keep pushing on that. But I'll tell you, I'm concerned, or maybe concerned's not the right word. I'm going to be placing a higher priority on overall Arctic communications. We just call it Arctic comms. And I think we've seen a little bit of this in just the news recently, is this whole Arctic domain awareness. What does that mean? You got a lot of space that you need to cover. How well are we doing it? A lot of stuff up north has been there a long time. And when we think about the implications of the changing climate, the warming climate, the permafrost, the erosion, what is that doing to some of these assets that have been sitting up there for a long time? How prepared are we from that perspective?
Something else that you touched upon, but I'd like to explore a little further. So it's been a very good year in so many ways, but there have also been some bumps in the road and some shadows that have been cast. It is next week the anniversary of first the illegal annexation and then the invasion. Beyond the atrocities, beyond the economic fallout, it did also do damage to international cooperation when it comes to the Arctic. And, I look at the seriousness of this. It's not simply that Russia had the chairmanship and the name, but all of the hard work that's being done around the fallout from changing climate, the importance of sustainable development, that's something that's been damaged. But it's also true that its chairmanship is winding down, and so hopefully we'll get back to the regular work that's being done. But how important is the quality of that cooperation to the interests of not just Alaska, but the entire Arctic Circle?
It is so important that the good work that the Arctic Council has done, that we don't see that slip back. You cannot put the Arctic on pause because of a war in Ukraine. But how do we work within these structures? And it has been a struggle. And keep in mind, this is following a 2-year period with COVID where a lot of the work, a lot of the research that was going on, I'm looking at it in the report here, the impact of COVID on some data collection is very real. We've got gaps now. So you've got gaps there because of a global pandemic. Now you have research that is being impeded or slowed or perhaps not happening because of Russia's actions, and yet we can't say, well, we're just going to take a moment here until things settle down. It doesn't work that way. I've had multiple conversations. I was in Norway. I was in Tromsø for the Arctic Frontiers several weeks ago with several in this room as well, talking to our friends from Norway about the Arctic Council. They will be next up to receive that. I think actually there's probably no country that is better positioned to take over the chairship. They have established relationships that they have worked with Russia even during this war. Fisheries management issues they've been able to work through. So there's a little bit more flexibility, I think, without being in a situation where we're saying nope. The work of the council has to predominate over the atrocities that we have seen out of Ukraine. That can't ever happen. We cannot pretend or suggest that what we are seeing in Ukraine every single day doesn't need to be condemned every single day. So we just can't resume with Russia and say, well, we're going to have to figure it out because we got to work with the Arctic Council. It's going to be different going forward. It's just going to be different. But how we work to ensure that the global commons, if you will, that we're taking care of that. So it's going to be a little rocky here going forward.
Senator, I could go on for some time. It's fascinating, and I think the way that you've just laid that out really does set the table for some of what we'll talk about during the day. So thank you for your leadership. Again, thanks for joining us here today. And thanks for all that you're doing. You're right, this actually does matter. And it's not simply when balloons are sighted, it matters all the time. And so we all have lots of work to do. Again, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Now you get to the real meat of the report. And I would stick around, but we've got a vote that starts like right now, so I apologize. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Senator Murkowski. Thank you, Ambassador Green. I am pleased to introduce our next segment, our next speaker, who is joining us with a pre-recorded video. We have Counselor Derek Chollet. Derek Chollet is Counselor of the U.S. Department of State, where he serves as the rank of Undersecretary as a Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of State on a wide range of issues and conducts special diplomatic assignments as directed by the Secretary. I have to note that the video he has shared with us was recorded before the announcement of Mike Safrega's nomination to serve as the Ambassador at Large for Arctic Affairs. Derek Chollet has asked to share these thoughts with you. And I'm quoting, "I'm thrilled about the nomination of Mike Safrega as the first ever U.S. Ambassador at Large for Arctic Affairs. I look forward to working with him following Senate confirmation as we continue to elevate U.S. leadership and engagement in the Arctic." So without further ado, we have a video from Derek Chollet. Thanks so much.
Thank you for inviting me to address the U.S. Arctic Research Commission annual meeting. I'm happy for this opportunity to share some thoughts with Arctic policymakers, researchers, leaders, businesses, and communities. I'm traveling out of the country this week, but I wish I could be there in person with you all. It's no secret how important the work of the Arctic Research Commission is. We see this again today as it outlines a set of Arctic research priorities and recommendations that will cover the next 2 years. The 2023-24 Arctic Research Goals and Objectives Report, as well as the overall work of the Commission, could not have come at a more important time. This administration is embarking on the implementation of our new National Strategy for the Arctic region. Meanwhile, we face a significantly more challenging international situation, including in the Arctic. These realities and efforts are interconnected. They create numerous opportunities for cooperation between the Commission and the rest of the federal government. Let me begin by offering a brief overview of the challenging environment in which we find ourselves since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine just a year ago. Then, I will outline how our new Arctic strategy navigates these changed realities. And finally, I'll show how the Arctic Research Commission's work is instrumental to my work, the Department of State, and the rest of the U.S. government as we advance our shared Arctic priorities. As the national strategy for the Arctic region makes clear, Russia's unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine has upended decades of cooperation and collaboration among the 8 Arctic states. Russia has the most territory and population north of the Arctic Circle. It is an important Arctic nation. But Moscow's decision to invade its neighbor, an independent and sovereign state, makes cooperation virtually impossible for the foreseeable future. Even before launching the largest European conflict since the Second World War, Moscow began an aggressive program of remilitarization of the Arctic. It began building or modernizing bases, expanding its icebreaker fleet, and developing and testing dangerous novel weapon systems. This ran counter to maintaining the high north as a region of low tension. Compounding the challenges from Russia, the People's Republic of China continues to pursue influence in the Arctic. It seeks to involve itself in Arctic governance and development of the region's natural resources. Beijing stood side by side with Moscow as declared in their February 4th, 2022 manifesto. And together, they have increased military cooperation in the Arctic. Last October saw a joint Russian and PRC patrol in the Bering Sea. This is of concern to the United States as well as to our allies and partners throughout the region and beyond. In addition to these growing geopolitical challenges, addressing the climate change crisis remains critical. The Arctic is warming more than twice as fast as the rest of the world. This means diminishing sea ice, thawing permafrost, and melting ice sheets. These Arctic tipping points would have a devastating impact on the entire world. They underscore the urgent need for rapid emissions reductions in line with the Paris Agreement temperature goal. Within the Arctic, climate change is driving a cascade of consequences, including coastal erosion, intense storms, and unstable ground. These effects jeopardize critical infrastructure and threaten Arctic communities and livelihoods from Ukavik on the north slope of Alaska to the many coastal communities throughout the Bering Strait and Bering Sea regions. Our new national strategy acknowledges this more challenging environment. It seeks to address the impacts of climate change by directing new investments in sustainable development to improve livelihoods, build resilience, and diversify the region's economy and energy generation. The strategy seizes the significant and growing economic opportunities in the Arctic through sustainable economic development. It follows high standards and involves local communities and indigenous knowledge. The strategy positions the United States to compete and manage growing geopolitical tensions by deterring threats to the U.S. homeland and to our allies and maintaining a robust U.S. presence in the Arctic. and it reiterates the U.S. commitment to international cooperation and sustaining institutions for Arctic cooperation, foremost the Arctic Council. The U.S. Arctic Research Commission's ambitious research goals and objectives for the next 2 years align perfectly with the new National Arctic Strategy and will play a critical role in advancing its 4 pillars. The research the Commission is prioritizing will be key to understanding environmental and societal impacts of climate and how to pursue risk reduction and adaptation. Partnering with state, local, and tribal governments, researchers can help us understand the challenges and devise tools to foster economic development that is sustainable and benefits communities. Research is also critical to designing civilian and military infrastructure that performs in extreme and in challenging conditions, as well as understanding the risk to existing infrastructure. And as the vibrant international research cooperation on an Arctic issue proves every day, the U.S. Arctic Research Commission's work drives the strong international cooperation as we aim to jointly tackle the myriad challenges we face in the Arctic. Russia's actions have significantly damaged international scientific cooperation relating to the Arctic. Unfortunately, we do not anticipate Russia will change its behavior anytime soon. Adjusting to this new reality forced upon us by Moscow, we resume the Arctic Council's projects not involving Russia, and we are working with Norway and other like-minded Arctic states about the way ahead. We are redoubling our cooperation with like-minded Arctic states on security, research, natural resource development, and the environment. As we are positioning ourselves, most notably the state of Alaska, to mitigate challenges and thrive in a changing geopolitical and natural environment, the work of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission is instrumental to each of these efforts and aligns well with our ongoing efforts across the government. I congratulate the Commission on an ambitious and timely set of goals and objectives for the next 2 years and for establishing a new foundation upon which Arctic research will be a central component of our nation's efforts in the region well into the future. Thank you.
It's now my pleasure to welcome Ambassador David Baldwin to the floor. Ambassador Baldwin is the Executive Director of the Arctic Executive Steering Committee within the Office of Science and Technology Policy in the White House. I'll note he also served previously as a Senior Fellow with the Wilson Center's Polar Institute. Ambassador Baldwin.
Thanks very much, Rebecca. Good afternoon to all of you. So let me start where Derek Shirley left off with congratulations to the Commission for a wonderful new report. The topics dovetail very well with U.S. Arctic policy initiatives, and this is no surprise, certainly no coincidence. Our nation not only has a long tradition of conducting world-class research in the Arctic, but of using the results of such research to inform policy decisions. And the reverse is true as well. The Commission and others like Larry Hinsman and his colleagues in AARPC shape the Arctic research agenda to support U.S. Arctic policy objectives. My role today is to provide a brief overview of the main policy coordinating body in the U.S. government today, the Arctic Executive Steering Committee, about which you heard a little bit already, to outline very briefly the new national strategy for the Arctic region and its forthcoming implementation plan, and to show you, by way of at least a few examples, of the links between policy and research. The Arctic Executive Steering Committee was created under President Obama by executive order. It operated for a couple of years, and it fell largely dormant during the Trump administration. President Biden, however, reactivated it shortly after coming to office. It's chaired by my boss, the President's Science Advisor, the head of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. The National Security Advisor serves as the vice chair. There's some 20 federal agencies, all the ones you can name and probably a few that you can't, that participate in this, and plus quite a few parts of the executive office of the president as well. We meet quarterly, more or less. The main role is to try to coordinate the activities of the U.S. federal government in the Arctic, no small feat. And we have launched eight by my count, multi-agency initiatives tackling some of the biggest problems in Alaska and the circumpolar Arctic as well. And right now, a lot of the focus, and you've heard about this as well, is to build an implementation plan for the national strategy. The national strategy was issued last October. It has a 10-year outlook. It addresses both the U.S. Arctic, Alaska, but also the circumpolar region. It has 4 pillars: security, climate change and environmental protection, sustainable economic development, international cooperation and governance. We hope to have an implementation plan out by the end of March. We're working diligently. Some of my colleagues working with me on that are here today. Stay tuned for more on that. But now, just to give you a few examples of the key intersections between the new goals report and the national strategy. The first goal, Mike Strager ran through all 5 of them, but just to review, deals with environmental risks and hazards. Probably the closest intersections are in this space, at least from where I sit. The national strategy calls on our nation, working with the state of Alaska and Alaska communities, to build resilience in the face of climate change and to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the Arctic. Take a look at the first set of recommendations in the new goals report. Just to pull out a little bit of the verbiage: expand, improve, and better coordinate Arctic monitoring of greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide and methane in particular, right? The second goal, dealing with community health and well-being, well, the national strategy commits us to improving, for example, healthcare services in communities. Doing so will require more research. The goals report calls for just that sort of research, including on one thing not properly known. Well, there's a lot we don't know, but perhaps not the subject of enough attention before, understanding the health threats stemming from emissions of permafrost thaw. Goal 3 deals with infrastructure. Well, the national strategy has a lot to say about the infrastructure that is needed not only in Alaska, but beyond Alaska in the Arctic. We need to expand ports and airfields. We need to extend the reach of broadband, for example. Some of the infrastructure will improve economic activity. Some of it will help resilience in the face of climate change. Some will improve national security. In all cases, and Senator Murkowski made this point when she was speaking right here a few minutes ago, the choices we make as a nation on improving our architecture in the infrastructure in the architecture will rely on many forms of research, just the sorts of research that the goals report calls for in Goal 3. Goal 4 deals with Arctic economics. Well, Pillar 3 of the national strategy is all about improving the economic circumstances in Alaska and beyond. Some of that, of course, relates to infrastructure that I was just discussing. But to take another example, the national strategy recognizes that our nation needs more secure sources of critical minerals. On the other hand, the mining of minerals in Alaska or elsewhere has legitimate environmental and social consequences that are not fully understood. We need research to make good choices in this space. The goals report outlines this as well. And finally, Goal 5 deals with research cooperation. Well, as Dirk Chalet pointed out, the international space in which research in the Arctic is unfolding has shifted over the last year. It is very hard to do collaborative research with Russia or Russian institutions currently. We need to figure out in a new way how to push forward with international research cooperation. Well, the goals report gives us some ideas for how to do this better. And to take one example near and dear to my heart, we have an Arctic fisheries agreement enter into force in 2021. We need to build a joint program of scientific research and monitoring. The goals report, sure enough, calls upon us to do just that. Bravo. Those are just a few examples. I could have gone on for a lot longer on that, but let me turn the floor over to the next speaker. Thank you very much, Rebecca.
Thank you, Ambassador Baldwin. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Larry Hinsman to the stage. Dr. Hinsman is the Assistant Director of Polar Sciences in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and he also serves and is perhaps better known as the Executive Director of the Interagency Arctic Research Policy Committee, or IARPC. Thank you very much for joining us today, Larry.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, Dr. Pincus. It's such an honor for me to be here today. This is a gathering of the Arctic All-Stars, and I'm just so privileged to be here. So, Chair Shrega, commissioners, thank you all. It's indeed a great pleasure to. I've been working in Arctic research since 1981, and so I remember when the Arctic Research and Policy Act was debated and acted upon, created, and I remember when the first Arctic Research Commission was formed and when the goals reports started coming out. I used those reports and still do, and these goals reports are incredibly important to the research community. These goals reports provide direction into what our researchers need to do, but they also provide justification for those proposals that go into the foundations, to the funding agencies. And they also provide justification to the agencies to support that research. And so these are a gold mine for our researchers, and I've used them forever. And I got to say, I know them all very well. I've used them a lot, and this is one of the strongest reports that's come out. So congratulations to the commissioners. I want to just echo what Senator Murkowski has said, in that I think this is one of the strongest commissions that we've had. So I'm really pleased with the commissioners. I was pleased with the selection, pleased with all the work that you've done. So, congratulations again for everything you've done. I just want to quickly go through, as Ambassador Bolton just did, make some comparisons to this goals report and to the work that the IARPC, the Interagency Arctic Research Policy, is doing, and that there is remarkable alignment. And that's not really a surprise, as Ambassador Bolton also implied, in that the Arctic Research Commission provides the justification. They do a tremendous amount of work looking at what needs to be done. They solicit input from a great many sources. They provide direction. We have really good communications between the Arctic Research Commission and IARPC, the Interagency Arctic Policy Committee. We are the boots on the grounds. The IARPC Collaborations Group, we have over 3,500 researchers involved, from federal and non-federal researchers. We're the boots on the ground that actually do the implementation of that research. But that research is only as good as its use. And the Arctic Executive Steering Committee really follows through with some great work as far as the implementation and acting upon that research. And so there's great collaborations among these entities. And there are many other circles in this Venn diagram. I wish I could have also put on here the Ted Stevens Center. Ted Stevens Center is doing some great work with respect to the security issues in the Arctic. And they are also acting upon the research guidance from the Arctic Research Commission. They're also acting upon the research activities of the IARPC to follow up on those security issues. So there's a great amount going on, but it's the coordination, it's the collaboration among these various entities in our nation and internationally that are helping to advance our sciences and our policy for our nation and for our world. So there's some, as Senator Murkowski was saying, there's some great work that's been done over the last 40 years. There's a lot of challenges before us. So these are the IARPC agencies. We've got 18 IARPC member agencies. IARPC exists as described in the Arctic Research and Policy Act. IARPC exists to facilitate the collaborations among the federal agencies and avoid duplication, and to get the most we can out of the research that is being funded by our various agencies. So the research activities that we take on, that IARPC takes on, are defined by the urgent research missions of these agencies. Everything that we take on has to be a priority for at least 2 or more agencies. These agencies have come up with the research needs, and also the Arctic Research Commission provides great input here. These agencies define what we need to do, and then the ARPIC collaborations teams act upon those activities, those suggestions to implement that. So in November of 2021, IARPIC published the next 5-year Arctic Research Plan, and so that is available online. There's copies out here. And just this last November, we published the implementation plan. And I will acknowledge the great input from Nikush Carlo. She helped us tremendously throughout this effort, so thank you very much, Nikush, for that. And many of you in the room also helped. We had great input. It was a great collaborative effort all the way across. So I'm going to back up a little bit with respect to I'll start with the policy drivers. And so if you note, there are 4 policy drivers that really set the tone for the stage on this. And these 4 policy drivers, I actually want to acknowledge the input from Simon Stevenson. These policy drivers have been really the U.S. Arctic policy for the past 40, 50 years. It's been very, very consistent. The Arctic global systems, that's just emerged in the last 20 years or so like that, but we've had a very consistent policy with respect to the Arctic. We also have 4 priority areas. And those priority areas are where the emphasis of the research is going now. And so those are community resilience and health, Arctic system interactions, sustainable economies and livelihoods, and risk management and hazard mitigation. And if you are looking at the goals report and you see the obvious alignment, that's as Ambassador Bolton said, it's not a coincidence. We've had good communications, we've had good direction. Also, amongst this Arctic Research Plan, we have 5 foundational activities. And these foundational activities are characteristic or classic research needs that permeate every bit of the research that we're doing. So they include data management, education and training. I'm sorry, I don't have my glasses, my right glasses. But also participatory research and indigenous leadership and research, and technology and innovation. So all of those cross everything we do, and just each of those foundational activities have connections and leads throughout the priority areas that we're implementing. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the interconnections that we have between our Arctic Research Plan, between the implementation plan, and the new goals report. And so in the Arctic Research Plan, we had 4 goals, as I just mentioned those. In following up in development of the implementation plan, we defined 21 objectives. Those were defined by our federal agencies, what they needed to be done. And from those objectives, we defined 90 deliverables. Those are 90 products that will be created, will be established, will be released within their 2-year period. So those are the activities that we're producing now. And those, if you scan the QR code there, you can access both of those reports, or you can gain them online. But those activities, again, are collaborations among federal researchers and non-federal researchers, including in the international Arctic research community. We have great engagement from the Europeans and the Asian research community, and so it's, as several people have already noted, the current war in Ukraine is creating conflicts for our research community, but we are moving forward and we will still produce these activities. It is a little bit harder for us now, but we're still going to produce these products. So these are the 3 overarching similarities between our activities, the Arctic Research Plan, and the goals report. And they include the research motivations, Arctic system interactions, and the Arctic Research Plan foundational activities. Those are all strongly emphasized within the goals report. And we do have obvious connections there and obvious interests where they connect. So I'm going to go through these a little bit in detail just to look at some of the important characteristics. So for PA2, Priority Area 2, Arctic System Interactions, that has been an area where the Arctic Research Commission has been interested for 40 years. Those are the areas where how the climate system is driving the Arctic, how the ecosystem responds to evolves with the climate, and how that reverberates, all those changes in the ecosystem, changes in the environment reverberate, affect the global system. And that's where the IARPC has done a tremendous amount of work since its inception. So we have really good understanding of the climate dynamics, its effect on the Arctic, and how that impacts the rest of the global systems. PA3 is sustainable economies and livelihoods, and we overlap very nicely there with the recommendation in the goals report as far as mapping and modeling current assets for resilience planning. PA4 is risk management and hazard mitigation, and again, that great connection to the goal 1. And also the connection is very well aligned with the research for infrastructure planning and the multi-risk assessments of environmental hazards. The U.S. Arctic Research Commission's Goal 2, Community Health and Well-Being, aligns very well, very, very well with our community resilience and health, particularly in workforce development and recruitment and retention, and also with the Arctic system interactions and the impacts of the changing systems, natural systems, that we'll have on humans. And it's not just natural systems; it's just the rapid change and globalization in the Arctic that's ongoing. The third goal of infrastructure aligns again very, very nicely with our PA1, with the community resilience and health, and the particularly emphases on water and sanitation, and again with Arctic system interactions with the impacts of the changing natural systems that will have on the humans. And then again with the third priority area of sustainable economies and livelihoods, and again mapping and modeling of current assets for resilience planning, and also then again with risk management and hazard mitigation, working with the community stakeholders on assessments. And then the fourth goal, Arctic economies, again that is important as far as the Arctic system interactions, looking at the changing natural systems on humans, but also our third priority area, which is almost perfect alignment with sustainable economies and livelihoods, researching the linkages between socioeconomic infrastructure and Arctic economies. And the final thing I want to emphasize is just the strong call for Goal 5 with respect to research coordination, research collaborations. That is what IARPC is all about. We emphasize, we live to create those collaborations across federal agencies, and also to building those connections with the non-federal researchers and with the international communities. So that's where I think we have the greatest capabilities. That's where our strengths lie. That's where our passion is. So again, we're really pleased with the collaborations, with the sister relationship that we have with the Arctic Research Commission, and we look forward to many more years of us good coordination. So thank you all.
I'm a little bit shorter than Dr. Hinsman, so I'm going to bring the microphone back down. Thank you so much. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. James Ulvestad, who is the Acting Office Director in the Office of Polar Programs in the Directorate for Geosciences in the National Science Foundation. Thank you so much, Dr. Ulvestad.
Thanks, Rebecca. It's an honor to address the commissioners. I'll say I'm a little nervous talking in front of the Arctic superstars. I've been in my new job. I'm starting the third week tomorrow. So you have a long history of doing research, of living and working in the indigenous communities. So I want to congratulate all of you on bringing this report and these goals as far forward as you have. So I'm here representing the NSF director, Setharaman Pachanathan. We are in the midst of a 2-day meeting of our governing organization, the National Science Board, and that's something that he can't get out of because they get the keys to the car if you're not careful. So he needs to be watchful. As I said, I've been in my new role for a couple of weeks. I'm an astronomer by training, but when I was asked last month to take over this role, it took me 2 minutes to say yes. I didn't ask any questions. I didn't ask for a raise. I didn't ask for anything like that because this is really important. I mean, Antarctica is important. The Arctic is important. We acknowledge that. We acknowledge that NSF plays an important role in research to help understand these complex problems that you've already heard about in the Arctic. The new goals and objectives report is an important contribution to our thinking, helps inform how we're going to support research in the foundation. And I want to congratulate the commissioners. Many of you are newly appointed. You represent academia, you represent indigenous communities, represent retirees in some cases. And I was actually told that you never retired, David, that you just kind of kept working without getting paid. But but I think, the expertise and the broad expertise that the commissioners have brought to bear in this report really shows in the many aspects of the report that others have addressed. So I wanted to talk a little bit about NSF's role here. In the IARPIC 5-year report that Larry just talked about, our NSF director actually is the chair of the IARPIC, and in his introductory remarks in the report, he said, and I'll read a quote here: "The Arctic continues to change rapidly, creating complex, dynamic, and multidisciplinary research questions. The changes in the Arctic have global consequences and profoundly impact Arctic communities who are an integral part of the Arctic environment." And I want to emphasize his point there about the Arctic communities being an integral part of the environment. You see that very clearly in the USARC report, okay? In the emphasis on the goals, the emphasis on economics, emphasis on sustainability. And in NSF, we see that as being a very important part of our role, is to support that research that deals with these connections between the physical infrastructure, the physical nature of the climate, and the impact on the Arctic communities. Excuse me. So we do appreciate the fact that the research that's talked about in the report focuses on risk reduction, sustainability, mitigation, as I mentioned, economics. The goals and objectives are important to us. So I'll mention in NSF, we have in our Office of Polar Programs, we have an Arctic social science program. It's the only social science program in NSF that doesn't reside in our social, behavioral, and economic sciences directorate. And you say, well, why is that? And why isn't that everywhere in NSF? Or why aren't we living in this social science directorate? And the answer is that Arctic research is very different because it's research on a region. It's not research on an individual academic discipline. And we need to treat it as such. We need to treat it as interdisciplinary. So we need to treat the Arctic holistically. There are over 4 million inhabitants in the Arctic. And so this is a really important aspect of it. In NSF, we try to address this through a mechanism that we call convergent science. So convergent science, we have a program called Navigating the New Arctic. It's a cross-directorate program. And it includes, among other things, we stood up an NNA community office, and Commissioner Carlo is involved with that community office. So convergent science is basically a solution-oriented science. It's aimed at looking at real-world issues that need attention, not just pointy-headed intellectuals who are doing something very important, which will result in improvements in our society in 20 or 30 years, but it's really informed by solutions that are needed in the real world today. And that's how we bring our social sciences research in to sort of work together with the natural sciences research. We think that's been a success for us so far. We're just getting started on that approach. It's new for NSF, like all research agencies. I'm an astronomer. I mean, I live over here as an astronomer, and somebody who's a geophysicist lives over here, and somebody who's a social scientist lives over here. So we're trying to break down those barriers, and that's particularly important in the Arctic. So I want to mention that along with the Social Sciences Directorate and our Polar Programs Directorate, we put a lot of effort into Arctic research in other areas of NSF, and I want to particularly call out the biological sciences, the ocean and atmospheric sciences in our own geosciences directorate. And I know that an important aspect of the USARC report was on data management. So the work that our folks do in computer and information science and engineering on large-scale data management, on data archiving, on data husbanding in the long term, that's really important. I think that is an effort that can be brought to bear on the goals of the USARC plan. So I wanted to finish off just by talking a little bit about funding. One thing that was mentioned, I believe, in the goals and objectives report is that the NDAA for 2023 basically tells the Office of Management and Budget, you need to do a census of all the funding that the US government is putting into Arctic research. Okay, we've got these plans. We've got a report that has 90 deliverables, I think you said, Larry. So we need to understand better than we do today, what resources do we really have to bring to bear to make progress on those 90 deliverables. So I understand that OMB has very recently kicked off that effort or said they're about to kick off that effort. So NSF looks forward to participating in that. And particularly, we want to work together with our other agency colleagues in helping those resources come together in a convergent way so that we can, we don't fund the same research the Department of Defense funds, but working together with them, we can do a better job for the Arctic. And the first step in that is understanding what we're all doing. So I think that's a really important part of this, just adding up numbers in funding. It's more than that. It's adding up, okay, what are the efforts that are coming in from the different agencies and how do they play well together? We're proud at NSF that we support several thousand researchers who are working in the polar regions, both south and north. Many of those range from undergraduate students to senior researchers. We expect that those people will be reading the USARC report. We hope and expect that they will be inspired by that report. They'll be motivated for their research. That will result in knowledge and innovation that benefits us all. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to close out my second week in my new job, talking to you all here. I want to congratulate Ambassador Designee Frege, and may you have only 2 weeks until your confirmation. And Rebecca, I'll turn it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Elvestad, for coming out in your second week to deliver such terrific remarks. We really appreciate it. It is now my pleasure to welcome Dr. Kelly Criss to the stage. Dr. Criss is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for International Fisheries at the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Unless you all are maybe confused by my title, I also serve as NOAA's Arctic Policy Lead, which is the role I'm serving in here today. So it's a pleasure to be here today representing the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration as NOAA's advisor to the Administrator on Arctic policy. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone here how deeply invested in research NOAA is to inform products and services that the communities in Alaska and the Arctic region rely on. And we look forward to working with all of you, as many have noted, all the superstars in the room, to achieve the objectives described in the U.S. Arctic Research Commission's Goals and Objectives report. It's clear to us at NOAA how much thought and consideration went into the report, and I think that you all have heard that and how much alignment there is with the national strategy, with the IARPC 5-year research plan. And I think when we look at it, we see that when implemented through agency and partner research programs, in conjunction with that 5-year research plan of IARPC's, the goals and objectives for the research outlined by the Commission will yield information and knowledge that will not only advance our understanding of the Arctic region, but inform decision makers regulators, and communities confronting the impacts of climate change across the region. Not surprisingly, many of the research priorities recommended by the Commission are consistent with NOAA's mission. And when I think about the Venn diagram that Dr. Hinsman showed, I see NOAA really integrated at the nexus of that Venn diagram. Some of our missions include monitoring and observing changes in the Earth system, predicting and tracking extreme weather events like the ones that the region experienced this year with Superstorm Merbok, mapping the ocean floor and charting hazards, abiding by our international obligations to monitor and research the marine ecosystem and fish populations in the Central Arctic Ocean and adjacent shelf seas. And finally, engaging meaningfully and productively with Alaska's residents and Indigenous peoples. I think it's fair to say that NOAA has one of the broadest ranges of connections, interests, and responsibilities in the Arctic region. Again, not surprising to the folks in this room, we conduct and support Arctic research on a wide array. I just got back after 3.5 weeks of being on the road, so I might trip a couple times here. We conduct research on a wide array of topics from marine mammals and marine ecosystems to oceanography and climate and weather. We're constantly improving our remote sensing capabilities via satellites and uncrewed vehicles. And let's not forget our oceanographic research vessels and airplanes. We're grateful that the Commission mentioned all of our work, including the impacts of weather on health, the emerging challenges of harmful algal blooms and ocean acidification, and our ongoing work to project sea level rise and grow Alaskan aquaculture. And we can't forget the annual assessment of the Arctic via the Arctic Report Card. I think it's really easy to point to some of NOAA's more recognizable products and the ones that you all are very, very familiar with. For example, our daily weather forecast. But there are a few things we do in Alaska that are unique. For example, I encourage all of you to catch the Strait Science, as in the Bering Strait, lecture series that NOAA Sea Grant organizes out of the Northwest campus of the University of Alaska Fairbanks in Nome for the benefit of local residents and those from afar who are curious about the region. And I believe, Dr. Hinsman, you just participated in one of those series. NOAA's work in the Arctic and Alaska relies on partnerships, and one of the most important is our ongoing relationships with the tribal entities in the state. Co-developing and co-producing products and services are essential tenets of NOAA's work in the region, as evidenced by the newly funded Climate and Equity Pilot Project with the Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, which aims to increase the capacity of the ANTHC to serve Indigenous community needs in response to climate change. Another great example, which is highlighted in the Commission's goals report, is the Sea Ice for Walrus Outlook. This joint effort of the Arctic Research Consortium of the United States, the Eskimo Walrus Commission, the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and the Bering Strait Native communities highlights how Alaska Native subsistence hunters, researchers, and NOAA can come together to meet each other's needs. On a personal note, and we didn't hear about this yet from anybody else, I've been working alongside other federal agencies and tribes, including the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of the Interior, to increase climate resilience in the Bering Strait region under a presidential executive order that also lied dormant after President Obama initiated it. Our efforts to foster relationships have resulted in historic meetings with the Bering Intergovernmental Tribal Advisory Council focused on co-stewardship and co-management of the Bering Strait region that we hope can serve as a model for future collaborative approaches. However, NOAA recognizes there is so much more we need to do and is actively working to identify where the needs and gaps are. Historic funding through the Inflation Reduction Act and other sources will help NOAA enhance our ability not only to deliver our mission in the Arctic, but also support the communities who depend on the information we provide both in Alaska and across the globe. I'm glad to see the Commission announced a goal on Arctic economic research, as NOAA has a keen focus on advancing and evolving the blue economy. The ocean data of today are essential to support our national economic growth, protect the ocean's health, and inspire solutions to societal challenges that, when addressed, can accelerate the ocean and coastal data and products of the future. In these brief remarks, I hope it's evident to you, as it is to me, how not only how vast NOAA's remit in the Arctic is, but also how committed we are to achieving it. NOAA's research and responsibilities for the Arctic region and how they link to the Commission's goals report, which reaffirms and reemphasizes some priorities and introduces new ones in light of the rapid evolution of the region. We look forward to continuing to work together with the Commission and other federal partners to advance our understanding and knowledge of the Arctic region. And I thank you again for the opportunity to represent NOAA at this event today.
Thank you, Dr. Chris, and thank you to all of our speakers for providing such a broad array of senior level perspectives. This has been a real treat. I'd like to thank all the speakers, thank our audience, give everyone one last round of applause, and then we will take a 30-minute break. Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. I'll just give another 30 seconds or so for others to file in. So we're at the second part of the program where we actually go through the goals report, some motivations, but the recommendations in the report, and then a little bit of a deep dive into each of those recommendations. And then we're going to invite onto the stage at the right time the commissioners. You've heard a lot about them. You finally will meet them, and even better, you will hear from them. So without any more delay, I want to introduce to all of you the Executive Director of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission, Dr. John Farrell. John, thank you.
Thank you, Mike. And I have some slides coming up, please. So I'm not Cheryl Rosa. Cheryl Rosa, I try to be. I try to channel Cheryl, but I'd have to go all the way to Europe to do that. She got stuck trying to get here because of difficulties in travel. So I'm going to hit for Cheryl today, and then I'm going to give my own presentation too. So bear with me as we get through this. But it's a real pleasure, first of all, to see all of you. It's nice to be together. It's nice that we're in this great Polar Institute here. It's wonderful. And we're just very pleased to be able to present and share with you some of the work that the Commission has done here. And so I'm going to try to go further into some of the details here. Interestingly, I'm going to skip some of this stuff because when ambassadors and senators do your work for you and say what your recommendations are, it's kind of, I don't need to repeat that as a staff member. It's already been done. But we'll try to add some interesting detail to some of what's been talked about, get to some granular recommendations that you'll hear about, and hopefully give you a deeper dive and a little bit more flavor into the report. So Cheryl was going to talk about the first three goals, environmental risks and hazards, community health and well-being, and infrastructure. You've heard about this, so I'm going to go off this a little bit. One of the motivations for this is that the risks from, and I'll start with the first one, the risks and hazards. There's huge social and economic consequences from these. And a lot of these risks and hazards are exacerbated by climate change. For example, you have landslides, you have slumps. Well, there are more of those now because the permafrost underneath them is thawing, leading to more of these. They're threatening highways, they're threatening pipelines. And so it's not just volcanoes and earthquakes. Mike pointed that out, but it's other things that are exacerbated by climate change. And when we used to get up here, we used to say that the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the global average. I'm sad to say that it's now 3 to 4 times faster than the global average. And it's not just temperature. The Arctic is acidifying at up to 4 times the global average. So there's a lot of things that are happening faster, more severe in the Arctic region. And so, the knowledge from the research in advance of disasters will really be valuable to us to reduce vulnerability and help prevent or lessen the effects. So that's why we're calling for research on environmental risks and hazards. Here's a picture from Hurricane or ex-typhoon Merbok. So this is coastal Alaska. I actually contacted the woman who took this picture, says, can we put this in our goals report? She says, please do. And I want you to see what this looks like. Oftentimes here, the ocean will be frozen and you won't have water coming inshore. But when the sea ice is not there and the floods come, it's flooded. So as I've mentioned, there's huge economic and social consequences. We hope to lessen the effects. As was already mentioned by Larry Hinsman, one of the things the commission is recommending is to really monitor from oil and gas facilities, for example, the emissions of carbon dioxide and methane. But also, as Ambassador Bolton mentioned, the importance of measuring this is to differentiate it from natural fluxes of methane and carbon dioxide from the thawing permafrost. If we're really going to get at sources and sinks, we really have to know where they are. So that's a really important one. Sea level change, it's going up because of the melting of Arctic ice from not just glaciers and ice caps, but our understanding of how the sea level change will impact on communities really requires additional mapping and sea level gauges. We have very, very few in Alaska, and we need more. We need to have that baseline understanding of how that's going so that we can do a better job of community planning. I talked about mapping a little bit. Permafrost thaw. So again, permafrost is the frozen ground. It's thawing tremendously in areas. It's leading to all kinds of challenges, not just for coastal communities, but a lot for the oil and gas infrastructure. Commissioner Mark Myers was telling me about some tremendous difficulties at some well sites and some wellheads about thawing permafrost. It destabilizes infrastructure in a huge way. Yeah, I talked about that. Yeah, mapping. Another thing that we really want to do, Ambassador Bolton already talked about the wildlife disease monitoring. That's a very important thing. Things are actually coming out of the ground. Anthrax that's been frozen for a long time. Suddenly when that's thawing, it still is activated. And that's a threat and a concern that's already raised its head in a couple places. And we're curious what else could be coming out. A big deal. These examples have already been talked about. The Sea Ice for Walrus and the Sea Ice Prediction Network do a much better job of this is with the communities. So much better job of letting communities know where the ice is, where their ice isn't. That's a platform upon which the walrus rest and feed from. So that's some very important things. So it's a nice integration of communities with improvements in sea ice forecasting. Geospatial data and maps are critically important. The access to geographic data, it really helps with decision making and reducing risks. And actually, this is where the state of Alaska has done a great job with the statewide digital mapping initiative, Alaska Mapped, and the Alaska Geospatial Office, all supporting the efforts to collect, acquire, and to analyze this data, disseminate it. So with a much better understanding of where you are. I mean, believe it or not, people don't know where certain mountains are in Alaska. I mean, the accuracy of knowing where some of these locations are is much poorer than you'd ever imagine, especially compared to the lower 48. So having a much improved digital elevation model, for example, and NSF played a big role in that. It was very helpful, is really critically important. The second goal is community health and well-being. It's already been talked about. Those are salmon strips. As was mentioned, the Infrastructure Act will bring a lot of money to Alaska, and it's important that money is spent wisely. As Senator Murkowski said, you don't want to invest using standards from 1970s, 1980s when you're going to be working on infrastructure. You have to understand and react to the current environmental conditions, which are significantly different than they were in the 70s and 80s. There's a lot of challenges that remain. Some of the recommendations, as was mentioned, maternal health. We have, I think one of our little factoids is that American Indian and Alaska Native women have pregnancy-related mortality rates that are twice the rate of white women in the nation. So that's a huge disparity that requires additional research and focus on. One of Commissioner Vo's favorite topics is workforce recruitment. And she rightly said to us, when you're talking about infrastructure, it's more than just pipes and chains and roads and rails. It's the people that operate this infrastructure. Tremendously important in small communities that you have people who are operators who understand reverse osmosis, who understand how the water and sanitation systems work in these small communities. So you need to bring that part, that's really part of the soft infrastructure that's necessary to operate the hard infrastructure. And there's some really interesting research that can be done on that. For example, at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson, there is a virtual reality training module that the maintenance crew uses. Maybe something like that could be adapted for people in communities to learn other ways to operate that kind of infrastructure. And the rest, I'll just skip over this for now. Telehealth, there's been some really nice progress in there. The Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute has over $110 million for research funding, and that's designated for studies focused on chronic care management using telehealth. When you've got a state as big as Alaska, 1 person per square mile, you don't have the same healthcare facilities available to everyone. So there's a lot of improvements that are being done. And also, the telehealth broadband pilot project is another example, which is connecting people in rural Alaska to healthcare providers, which is significant. Talked about maternal mortality and remote patient monitoring too. There's ways now that you can actually hook up to certain systems and check vital signatures and so on that doctors are able to do from abroad. From beyond. Because really, in many ways, Arctic Alaska is oftentimes referred to as a medical desert. And the access to hospitals, primary care physicians, and so on is not what we are used to down here. And there is research that's available and being conducted to help shorten that distance. Infrastructure E. That's a photograph I took in Kivalina in, I think it was 2009, when they were building a revetment of rock to try to keep erosion at bay. Incredibly expensive to build these things. $20,000 a linear foot, something like that. In some places, $30,000. In part because they don't have rocks there, so they have to bring the rocks in from other places. But incredibly important infrastructure, and it's important that it's done right. So some of the motivations are, using the proper technology, innovation. Things that work elsewhere don't always work in the Arctic. George Newton, a prior commissioner, always told me this, that whatever tools you have in the lower 48 oftentimes do not work in these environments. And it's so very true. So you have to have the proper technologies and tools when working in this region. We're looking to increase efficiencies and economies of scale, as people like Liz Carvalho can tell you from all her challenges that she faces in Northwest Arctic Borough. And we mentioned a little bit about the human infrastructure. So some of our recommendations in infrastructure is to work closely with communities and local organizations when we're conducting our research to identify mechanisms, create, adapt, and maintain technology that really supports this infrastructure. We're also trying, as Dave Walton has said, this whole of government approach. Too often we come in with one agency or another agency, and we really need to do this together. The Department of Defense has had some real interesting concerns about this, and they are working feverishly to try to, as Commissioner Richter Mengi has emphasized to us, to develop plans to address installation resilience and environmental risks and threats to assets and infrastructure. Thule Air Base is a good example of that. So we've got some other ones on that. Also, I mean, when talking about infrastructure, as Mike Sofraga mentioned, it's also research infrastructure. NSF has a big deal ahead of itself in terms of the summit station in Greenland. That's a big infrastructure tooling. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention icebreakers as infrastructure that can be used for multiple purposes, not just traditional DHS missions, but also in support of science and, again, in a whole of government approach. Aviation Research is a great center at University of Alaska Fairbanks. I always like to call out ACUSI. It's Alaska Center for UAS something or other, but they fly drones. They fly drones up there, and they've done some great work. They get a lot of funding for this, and it's one of our nation's premier places. They have great test ranges to fly in, so a lot of good work is done there. I mentioned the virtual reality training. Adaptive engineering is something that we'll talk about further with Commissioner Richter Mengi, and the capacity building too. So now I will invite to the stage three commissioners: Commissioner Richter Mengi, Nakush Carlo, and Deborah Vo, please. And we have invited each commissioner to give a few minutes of remarks, reflections on these, to expand on the things that they found most important and relevant beyond what I've introduced here and what you see in writing. So I think we'll start from, I'd say ladies first, but
happily, that's not.
We can go left to right or right to left. Would you like to start, Jackie?
Sure. Is this on? Can you hear? Yeah, great. Okay, well, I'm very pleased to be here today. I am super pleased to see this in publication. I have to tell you, as been said before, there's a lot of iterations that have gone on to make this report. And it's just exciting to see it in print. It's beautiful. I think, is Ellen here? It's beautiful. And I've seen your work before, and this lives right up to it. But this is also packed with an incredible amount of information. And like Larry Hinsman had said, my career was in research. I spent a lot of time reading these reports to get guidance and using them in my proposals to say this is why you should be funding me. So I hope you all will take a read through it. It's actually quite accessible relative to many other dense reports that you might see. And like I said, there's a lot of pretty pictures. I also want to say how much of a privilege it has been for me to participate in the process of making this report and frankly being a commissioner. The commission and the staff at U.S. Arctic Research Commission are just amazing. There's a lot of knowledge. It's a small commission, but there's a lot of diversity of opinion. So there's some, has been alluded to, some great conversations. And I'm here to tell you, even as a mature person, you can learn a lot from these conversations. And I really feel enlightened by the conversations that I've had for my colleagues. So it's a real pleasure. So let me do my job here and talk to the first goal, which is environmental risks and hazards. I want to back up a little bit, and it's a point that John made speaking about George Newton, and that is the fact that even without the warming that we're seeing in the Arctic environment, the Arctic is a unique, a beautiful, and super challenging environment to live and work in. So you already have a landscape that at the time that the commission was actually established, we weren't even thinking about climate change. We were just generally thinking about how this unique environment causes us to have to adapt the tools and capabilities that we have. But put on to that this accelerated rapid warming that we're seeing in the Arctic, and it shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that in this icy environment, when you begin to warm it, you begin to have some major problems. And that is one of the reasons why you see this as our first goal. It's not just randomly placed here. It's really a foundation of many of the concerns that you'll see throughout the report. I myself spent a career documenting the changing Arctic region. And I can tell you over my 35-year career, it's profound. You don't many times in your life see climatic changes happen on the matter on a scale where you can live your life and say, this is a different environment. I started in the 80s. It is not the same environment that it is today. And I'm not alone in being an eyewitness to that. If you ask anybody who lives or works in the Arctic, they will have similar changes to talk about, or a similar thing. I am also thrilled by the fact, and you'll see this in not only this goal, but other goals, is there is an increased awareness and sensitivity to the fact that the changing environment has significant socio and economic impacts on the people who live and work there. That, to me, I think is a really important part of this report. As I've mentioned, this sort of goal with regard to, I think it's been usually called Arctic observations, has been in the report previously. But when we sat down to do this particular goal, we wanted to acknowledge the fact that Mark will talk about the paucity of data, but we have really had a good history now with some baseline data. We've got an increased knowledge. We don't want to discourage the fact that we need to maintain this baseline data sets and also expand on them. But we want to be letting people understand that we have a knowledge base now that allows us to support research that's really looking at assessing and mitigating the impacts. So that's a change that you'll see from in the motivation of this report, is really a shift from just observing to applying that knowledge to reduce risks and hazards. And that is a research area, learning how to apply these data in order to do that. So it does fall under the research purview. We also talk about the fact that geological hazards, oftentimes when we think about the change in the Arctic, we think things on a climatic scale, which they're fast, but they're not super fast. But these geological hazards can cause a catastrophic change in a very short amount of time. And we want to bring that to light too. Those hazards have been named, but they're changing in their frequency, their severity, and where they're located. And we're talking about things like landslides due to thawing permafrost, loss of coastline suddenly, pathogens. So things, again, it's been a nice day today because a lot is repeated, but I don't know, having grown up, I like repetition. So that we wanted to highlight that as well. And one final thought is, when you often talk about observations, you think of air, ice, ocean, and land, but we want to point out that we're talking about also the flora and fauna that are supported by this particular environment. So I see things that are the same in this particular goal, but I also see an evolution of change in this particular goal with this emphasis in its application and concern for how the environmental change that we're seeing is affecting the communities on a local, a regional, national, and global scale. And I want to point out one thing that hasn't been talked about too much. We have a centerfold. It's not that kind of centerfold, but we are trying to draw attention to the fact, we want to convey the importance of the Arctic and the fact that things that are happening in the Arctic just don't stay in the Arctic. And so we are working here to get news out about how changes in the Arctic are affecting communities on a variety of scale. And these are just examples. We could come with more, but anyways, thanks for the opportunity.
Well, thank you, Jackie. And now Commissioner Carlo, please.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Nakush Carlo. I'm Koyukon Athabaskan from the interior region of Alaska. I do live on Duwamish land in Seattle, but I have roots to the village of Tanana, which is at the confluence of the Yukon and the Tanana rivers. Is audio okay? Good, okay. Just want to check.
Move closer.
Oh, nope, I'm getting the move closer to the microphone sign. Thank you, Jack. So I just want to start with why the Arctic is important to me, and part of that reason is because all of you, all the people who live and work in the Arctic and really care about the region and want to work together, and that is really essential for us to move forward, as we adapt and work in a region that is rapidly changing. And we've heard that a couple of times. And it's worth saying again that the Arctic is warming significantly faster than other places around the world, and that it's accelerating at an alarming rate. It also means that the changes that are felt in the Arctic are felt way beyond the Arctic. And this speaks, in part, I know we have an online audience with us, so wherever you are in the world, you are connected to the Arctic. And that's something that we really want to continue to emphasize and get across to further bring us together so that we can work on solutions. In reflecting on the community health and well-being goal, you've heard some of those recommendations focused on climate-related health, social risks, maternal health, health disparities. It also includes research regarding restoration, use, and stability for Arctic Indigenous languages. Critically important, and also a recommendation to improve Indigenous participation and leadership in research. And I want to spend some time there talking about that specifically, because we know that we need to work together. We need to form a foundation of trust and respect in order to address the inequities that we see in research itself. And one of those things is really valuing Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous wisdom to bring that information forward and uplift it in order to find practical solutions to the challenges that the Arctic is facing. So including traditional Indigenous knowledge, including Indigenous language, including co-production approaches, supporting Indigenous-led research is going to absolutely be necessary for us to move forward in the future. So how do we get there? So I'm going to share with you a framing. I've been talking about this a lot. It's called, I call it an Arctic 180. And at the core of this is taking a 180-degree flip in point of view and in action. So in other terms, flip the script. So drive a change that drastically alters the outcome. Give you an example. So what if we stop designing streets for cars and instead focus on design to keep pedestrians and bicyclists safe? This has happened. Tokyo, Stockholm, they've flipped the script. They've looked at things from a different point of view. So another example, what if instead of tribes responding to dozens, many tens of dozens of different funding opportunities, what if tribes shared their strategic plans and priorities, and the federal agencies and federal governments and other funding partners figured out how to get that done? So what if federal agencies who hold research funds for tribes or fund priorities that are important, but what if the tribes and Indigenous organizations held abundant funds so they could issue those RFPs? So they could say, here's our priorities. We now want the research community to respond. You work on the design of that research project. You come out with outcomes and priorities that are very relevant, essentially relevant to those who are on the ground facing the most drastic and urgent changes that we have seen on our planet today. So this 180-degree flip in point of view has been successful in Canada. There's an Inuit IQP program that enables research in Inuit Nunaat by Inuit, for Inuit. Has support from ArcticNet, but it's the only Inuit-led and governed and directed research program in the world. And in 2022, they had $1.8 million to issue an award to research that met their priorities. So that's just one example of an Arctic 180. And my challenge is to all of you who work in this space is to consider where you can flip the script. Where can you look at things a little bit differently? Where can you drastically change outcomes? So I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. And finally, Commissioner Vo, please.
I'm going to look back there to make sure you can hear me with a thumbs up. Can you hear me? Well, I'll take that as a yes. Good afternoon. My name is Deborah Vo. I'm Yupik Eskimo, born and raised on the Lower Yukon River in St. Mary's, Alaska. And I like to do the hand map, of Alaska because a lot of people don't know where St. Mary's is. So I live and work on Dena'ina land in Anchorage. St. Mary's here's the Aleutian chain. St. Mary's is up here on the Lower Yukon River. We're about 100 miles from the Bering Sea inland. That's where I was born and raised, the youngest of 10 children. So I'm very pleased to be here this afternoon. As a commissioner, I am honored every day to be amongst such scientific intellectuals. Sometimes I'm like, gee, I should have paid more attention in Sister Lucy's class. Get to study that periodic table more. But anyways, I've been asked to talk about infrastructure. And John, you mentioned kind of my passion over the years working in rural Alaska for Alaska tribes has been workforce development. That's just, in my view, a nice fancy word for, how do we, educate and train our children for these jobs that, all this infrastructure is coming in, whether it be a new health clinic, water and sewer. Now more lately, we have broadband coming in. And so there are great opportunities out there. And one of the things that we face is workforce retention out in rural Alaska. How do you get these young men and women interested in these training opportunities and education so that they can keep up those clinics that we're building out there? They can, be out there splicing, the wire for the broadband or doing all the fixing, when a big windstorm comes in. So I've been asked to kind of look at what are some of the, not challenges, but some of the victories that I've seen. And my focus is more on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta because that's where I grew up. And I'm very well aware of the challenges out there as far as workforce development and retention. So I just want to mention a few that just came to mind. The first is Ute Litnalvik, which means the People's Learning Center. It's a learning center located in our hub community of Bethel on the Kuskokwim River. And what Ute tries to do is provide the training and education in areas that are essential for the workforce in the area. For example, and they have partners that help with the training, that contribute, like the Yukon-Kuskokwim Health Corporation, which is our health provider out in the region. We have the Regional Housing Authority. We have the local school districts that all contribute to what their needs are, and they kind of project out, the number, the workforce they will need, health aides in the communities, heavy equipment operators, and things that'll keep the village running. So they've done a great job, I think, over the past 10, 15 years that they've been in operation and working with their partners in getting that training done. One of the other organizations that came to mind, of course, everybody has in one way or another heard of ANSEP, or the Alaska Native Science and Engineering Program that's housed at the University of Alaska Anchorage. I think Dr. Schroeder, under his leadership, has done an amazing job in recruiting and getting private, public philanthropy excited about STEM for Alaska Natives. And we've seen the program grown from just high school, and now it's K through post-secondary. And what they do there at ANSEP with their classes, it allows students to get excited about the STEM subjects. It allows them to take classes and to earn college credit, so that by the time they graduate from high school, they're already ahead of the game. So I love the ANSEP program and the wonderful things that it has done. On a more local level, well, not local, but maybe statewide again, there's a nonprofit called the Excel Academy, and it partners with rural school districts, and it targets junior and senior high school students and gives them the opportunity to explore careers and training. We got students that come in from the villages anywhere from 2 weeks at a time to 6 weeks to explore like vocational training and just the simple thing of getting a driver's license. As you know, Alaska has maybe, one or two roads? And the rest of the travel is by airplane. So I didn't get my driver's license till I was 21 and in college. And the only reason was because my parents were coming to my graduation and I had to drive them around. So that was motivation enough. There are no DMVs in St. Mary's. So for anyone in the village, you know, folks get really excited when they turn 14. Oh, I'm going to get my learner's permit, That doesn't happen in the village. You have to fly into Bethel, which is a $500 round-trip ticket. And you're lucky if someone from Department of Motor Vehicles is there to give you the test. And then to fly back home, you keep your fingers crossed that the weather is cooperating. So it's quite expensive, and I think it's a barrier to a lot of the training that is needed out in rural Alaska to operate and maintain the infrastructure that's going on out in rural Alaska. So just those three, I think, areas I just wanted to highlight because there are so many challenges. There's always silver linings somewhere. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I have canned questions, but I always hate those. And so I think we'll throw caution to the wind and invite questions from the audience. We have microphones on both sides. If people are shy or reticent, don't worry, I have questions. But let's give you an opportunity to ask these knowledge holders some questions about what they've been presenting here today. So please, I invite you. And soon I will appoint you. Shoko.
Hi, Shoko Shinbrut, Office of Polar Programs. I'm curious what, in developing the goals and objectives report, what were the most contentious issues that you're now very proud to put forward and have worked through? Thanks.
I'll start.
I was like,
There's going to be a fight about that, too.
I think the discussions that we've had in one part on balancing the emphasis of rural communities to other issues that are facing not just the state of Alaska, but we also have a North Atlantic sector of the Arctic, trying to seek a balance that some points just didn't seem as important as pointing out the challenges in the local community. So I would say that that's been a discussion that we had that is reflected in the report. There were some things that were lost along the way that were kind of, on a bigger scale.
I think to that point, not everything can go in the report, right?
True.
And that was one of the very, I think, early discussions we had, is a huge long list of items. How do we get down to some reasonable number? And to say that I think we're probably still trying to find that balance. I personally think that smaller number is better in terms of putting resources and time and really focusing in on the things that are absolutely essential and critical. I'm not thinking of any other big points of contention. I will say that it's really helpful during our meetings to have different points of view and different evidence and presentations, and having that dialogue and being able to ask questions. That's super informative to us when we later go back and try to put things into the report that you see now.
Exactly. I just want to say ditto. So, but, getting that 30,000 foot level, I think, and trying to include, like, we had like a whole list of things, like, how do we squeeze that all in, and so we have to go high to make sure, nothing is not included. So I think that was, like, for me at least, the hardest thing to do. And as Nakush said, hearing different points of view was really important. Like I said, I sit, with scientists, and I should have paid more attention to Sister Lucy. And, but, to be able to be in part of that discussion and to learn and to ask questions, I think has been very, very beneficial.
Yeah,
Great.
if I can I
Yeah,
add one more
please.
thing? I think Mike did a good job of reminding us that this is just a launch pad for discussions. So we're allowed to go off script at times with some of the other things that you don't see in this report. So we're hoping that by being out there a bit more, you realize us as a resource and will call upon us for some discussions about maybe some of our other thoughts that we had that didn't make the report.
Mm-hmm. 2 years is not a long time.
It is not
It
a
comes
long
out
time.
every 2 years. So if you see something in there that's not, that you think should be, I want to know that. Come tell me.
Thank you. My question is for Dr. Carlo. I thought that your suggestion on the 180 was very compelling. As someone who used to work for a federal agency, and in my role, recognizing the extreme difficulty we have had in some cases getting money into communities, I'm wondering, either from your experience or whether or not the commission as a whole has thought about how the federal agencies can potentially get out of our way and do something like what you're suggesting. And I wonder if the Canadian example has any lessons learned for us, or just how we would start thinking about doing that given some of the constraints that the agencies have. And before you answer that, Ambassador Bolton over here had a question as well.
I get double questions, so I need to write them down.
Well, I'm not sure who this is for, whoever wants to answer it, I guess. About a couple of months ago, the White House released some guidance on using indigenous knowledge in federal decision-making. And I'm wondering what any of you think are the next steps in applying that guidance in the Arctic space, and in particular in furtherance of the goals report.
Okay, I can start with the question. Thanks, Kelly, for asking about potential options. I'm speaking from my own sort of point of view here. I think you could think about different ways of moving funds around. And one example to consider, again, you need a lot more conversation about this, is compacting. So that's a government-to-government agreement. So U.S. federal government with tribes. So you could think about compacting for research in all the different facets of research that there is. And so there's there's examples within the state where this has been very successful. I'll point to ANTHC, Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium, which is, has a compact to provide health services. But think about that from a research point of view. I think you could also look to the Canadian example. There were many steps that led up to that, in my understanding, and some of you here might be more familiar with that program than I am, but my understanding is that there was a lot of effort to develop research priorities and strategies for the Inuit organization, and that eventually then led to the development of a funded research program that's supported by our ArcticNet. So thinking about, what does it look like if there's an Indigenous commission that is providing those recommendations? Just some ideas.
Anything to add, Deborah?
Well, I was thinking about, as you were speaking, Nakush, about how to integrate Indigenous knowledge into research. Mm-hmm. And I think there are mechanisms already out there. I mean, Nakush mentioned compacting, which has been very successful in Alaska with Alaska tribes. I think our tribal healthcare system is a prime example of self-determination. And I think that model can be copied, if you will, when it comes to research. Because I'm a really true believer that the eyes and ears of what's happening out there are the Indigenous peoples that see it every day. And there has to be a way, there are mechanisms like compacting where this can happen, where it gives tribes the voice to say, these are our priorities. This is what we want. So scientists, give me your proposals. This is what we want. And I think the great thing about that is it doesn't put like science in a silo. We're a very sharing people. We like to share everything. I mean, it's in our food, and it's in our language, it's in our dance. We share everything. So sharing the science amongst the Native community is very important. I think the models are there. It's just a matter of kind of like flipping it, looking at it through our lens and what has worked. So.
Those are great remarks. I really appreciate that. And I think what we'll do to get back on schedule is we will thank you all, and then John Farrell will come up and give his presentation. Thanks, Jack. Okay, so to continue with this, again, you have my spiel, and then we'll bring 3 more commissioners up and have a discussion. Goal 4 in the goals report I am very excited about, because this is a completely new goal that we've never had before on Arctic economic research. And I really need to thank Dr. Lawson Brigham for recommending this a long time ago. And part of the motivation in so doing was, we've all talked about environmental changes in the Arctic. We've all talked, and for example, the sea ice is going away. There's going to be shipping everywhere. And Lawson will be the first to tell us, but have you done the economic analysis to determine, is that really economical? Does it pencil out to have Arctic shipping just because some of the ice is gone? And in many ways it doesn't yet, or certain types of shipping do, others do not yet. And so the important part that Lawson encouraged us on with Arctic economic research is to really try to get classically trained economists to focus on the northern region. And interestingly, in my survey, I have found very few classically trained economists who've actually focused on a lot of the types of issues that we're talking about, whether it's minerals, whether it's resource development, whether it's shipping, tourism, or anything. And so what you have is a bunch of natural scientists waving their hands about all the activity that's going on without any economic data to support it. So the commissioners, I think rightfully so, said, how much of this really pencils out? This research is vital to inform the policies and decision making. And so I got about 20 economists together, and I said, we're going to do a goal on this. And the first thing they said is, no, we need to be in every goal, not just one goal. I said, I'm sorry, we're putting you in one goal, but we will mention you elsewhere. And then I got a great amount of feedback on this, and we really learned an awful lot about this. So this is something where there have been some people. NSF supported a workshop on this in 2017, for example. And so there has been some work on the social sciences in this area, but there's a lot that remains, and there's some really great opportunities here. All kinds of things. I'm getting ahead of myself. So there's a picture of Red Dog Mine. That's a classic type of economic development. That's in northwest Arctic Borough, a big zinc mine. Very few economists focus on this region, as we've learned. I mean, there's classic fields in economics like development economics. Has that been applied to this region? It's often applied to developing nations, but not necessarily to this region. There's also natural capital accounting, which is some way trying to put values on things that we take for granted, like clean air, clean water. That has true value. How do you begin to put value on that, and how do you enter that into the discussion? So we need it for sustainable development, to understand market forces and natural capital, as I mentioned, and even indigenous economies. So some of our recommendations have been, and the economists will tell you this first, we need socioeconomic data. The government is not collecting the right data in order for us to do these types of analysis. So we need to start doing that across the federal family. We need to look at non-traditional assets. How are in the energy in the clean energy transition, where and how is this going to pencil out in Alaska as we move from an oil and gas economy to hydrogen to ammonia? Where does this make sense? And where are there true opportunities? And we think there are many in the Arctic. Mariculture is a really new and untapped opportunity in Alaska. The state of Alaska is focused on this. The governor had a task force on this. We think there's all kinds of ripe opportunities there, but what makes sense economically? Of course, has been mentioned, broadband and also the satellites that are Starlink and so on that are coming in are real game changers, and the economics behind some of that. I mentioned already Arctic marine shipping and marine operations, which are big. And also we thought it was a great idea to create an ocean technology test bed for mariculture and ecosystems. This could be done at, say, Kasitina Bay or someplace like that. So some examples of this are, and I'm very happy in the audience, we have two members of the blue economy here from Alaska. We have from Pole Arctic, a small company that's really on the rise. We have Leslie and Lauren here, and they have been part of an ocean cluster that's in the state of Alaska. And they're a real success story about providing services and products to this new growing blue economy. The blue economy was also mentioned by Kelly Chris today. It's a major priority of NOAA, and they're doing a lot of work in this in areas I can barely keep track of, in so many different areas, whether it's kelp, whether it's oysters, whether it's so many different types. So this is big. University of Alaska has a center on the blue economy. And so Launch Alaska is another incubator and an innovator. So there's a lot of interesting work that's research related as well in this area, and it's only going to continue. A tip of the hat to the Arctic Council is the EcoNor 2020 report. This is where the Norwegians do a tremendous service to the global Pan-Arctic community by really providing a great Arctic Council report on the economy and its socioeconomic conditions, traditional production activities for indigenous peoples. So it's led by Norway and the U.S. and Canada. Simon Council also plays a role in that report. So it's very useful. I would encourage you all to read it. It has incredible amounts of information in it. And as I mentioned before, valuing Arctic ecosystem services and natural capital. This is a really interesting and new area. In fact, the White House put out a recommendation on this in general, but I think a lot of these things haven't been applied to the north yet. So I think there's a lot of stuff out in the lower 48, lower latitudes that can be brought to bear into the Arctic region, with I think some really promising opportunities. The fifth goal is research cooperation, which has been mentioned. This is broad, and it's on multi-levels, whether it's international, domestic. The Commission worked I'd like to mention this, though, in terms of cooperation. The Commission worked really hard to engage with the state of Alaska on cooperation, as Mike mentioned very briefly. But we had a number of phone calls, a number of Zooms with Department of Natural Resources and other representatives about what their priorities were. We listened to them last April. We got from the governor's staff a list of what their priorities are, and we took a very close look at that, probably more than we ever have in the past on the Commission. And so we found that was a fruitful discussion. There's not always alignment of interest. There really aren't. But there was enough common ground that we found a lot of things that, for example, scenarios. They're very keen on developing scenarios in the state of Alaska, and that's something that we could do as well. Let's see. So part of the reason for motivation, or part of the reason for cooperation, is that so many of the things we study or care about don't stop and start at the border of Alaska. So these are pan-Arctic issues: weather, climate, sea ice, marine mammal migration, so on. These require international cooperation. We really can't assess how many walrus we have until we get information from Russia on that, because they don't respect the maritime boundary line between the two. So this is, by its nature, it's transnational. We find that when there's international cooperation, you actually, it serves as a form of soft diplomacy, which is helpful. It helps establish norms and transparency and common interest that we find sometimes then spills over into other areas, into diplomacy. And so sometimes science can be used as a diplomatic tool that we are very proud of and encourage. And so much so that sometimes the demand for knowledge actually helps to reignite cooperation in other ways. So that's all. A great example has been the extended continental shelf of all the nations, where there has been, U.S. and Canada was cooperating in order to map our continental shelves, because it's so expensive to do that. And that's where NOAA comes in the USGS. Also important, cooperation has been already discussed, but it's worth emphasizing, is in the co-production of knowledge. And it really leads to genuine collective efforts to increase understanding. And so one of our recommendations is to follow some of the engagement standards that the Inuit Circumpolar Council has put forward, and some very nice documents on that. We are recommending increased cooperation with Horizon Europe, which is a very big it's every decadal, the decadal program put out by the EU. And there's a lot of money in that. And we think there are opportunities for U.S.-Europe collaboration that probably should be expanded. There are some very good examples. UAF had a great one with air ice last time around, but there are other opportunities that really should be taken advantage of there. And sorry for the acronym there, but the Central Arctic Ocean Joint Scientific Program for Research and Monitoring that Ambassador Bolton talked about. This was a treaty obligation. Everyone signed the treaty. In that treaty is the call for a scientific program. Well, now we have to do that. NOAA's taking the lead. They're working feverishly on a framework agreement for this program, and we should hear more about that later this summer. Very glad to hear about that development. We're also recommending a university-affiliated research center on Arctic research related to DoD interests. That could be anywhere in the nation. But these types of centers would be complementary to, say, what the Ted Stevens Center is doing. And so that's something that we're keen on, and we'll be talking with DoD about that. And then one of my favorite topics, and Shannon's here and from the Coast Guard, is that, when you start talking about icebreakers, you really have to talk along. One icebreaker year is 10 years. It's kind of like the reverse of a dog's year, right? And we are making, Coast Guard's making good progress. DHS is making progress. Thank you, Tasha, on these things. And the planning we're talking about here is making sure there are requirements to, it's not just to meet DHS traditional Coast Guard missions and your primary duties, but also these in the whole of government approach to make sure that these platforms, which are very expensive to build and to operate, serve the entire government's needs to the extent possible. And so while you're out there, map the sea floor. While you're out there, do some scientific research, even if it's science of opportunity rather than a dedicated expedition. So we're really trying to encourage the U.S. community to take a fresh look at the science drivers and the science mission requirements necessary for the next generation of icebreakers. And Coast Guard's been very receptive to this, and we're really looking forward to ongoing discussions. Okay, awareness of expeditions. This was a nice thing that, a tip of the hat to IARPC. IARPC did an excellent job of bringing together communities in Alaska and making them aware of all the oceanographic expeditions. So I give a tip of the hat to people like Renee Crane and Larry Hinsman and others, saying, you know what, we need to let these communities know when these boats are going through, what they are doing. So there was an excellent website that said, here's what's going where, so that you know. It increased the communication, and therefore it facilitated the research. Mosaic that's an acronym. I don't remember what it stands for, but it was a gigantic international expedition that was extremely successful. I think it was $160 million spent, and it was to really study the Arctic night. So they drifted through the high Arctic on the German vessel, and there were teams that went in and out for a long time. NSF was a major supporter of this in a very significant way. And so that is an example of international cooperation that was just extraordinary. And I encourage you to read about Mosaic whenever you can. Other examples, a smaller scale, but still equally important internationally, tracking animal movements between U.S. and Canada. Certain herds, for example, go, again, ignoring boundaries, go both ways. So this is another example that it's good to see. Finally, this is not a goal, but Commissioner Mark Myers really gets credit for this, is saying, you know, data analytics and informatics, which puts Mike to sleep, but but it certainly excites Commissioner Mark Myers, and rightfully so. I mean, there's a lot of really interesting opportunities with our new increased computing power, with AI, with big data, and really it does inform the policy cycle. This diagram's in our booklet. I'm not going to go through it because it's rather complicated. But really, these advances will transform production of Arctic knowledge. They really will. And they will also, more importantly, give us give us information when we need it, which is really important. Because sometimes you need the information, you can't wait a week, a month, and so on. So that's going to be very helpful. And as Senator Murkowski said, we need evidence-based frameworks to make these decisions. So do what you do, Commission, to make sure that we have nonpartisan, we have just good scientific information. So some of the recommendations are to invest in Arctic-specific open-source private-public data collaboratives, increase the U.S. government efforts to capture historical Arctic data rescue. So there's a lot of information that has not been, is not accessible now, but is not easily accessible, but it's there. It needs to be reanalyzed and made available. One great example about, you know, private-public data collaboratives is when the USGS released the Landsat imagery. And then there was an explosion of groups taking that up and using it in so many ways. And we have other opportunities to do that. You could almost include in there some declassification of stuff. This is something the Commission worked on for a long time, getting Navy to declassify some of the information which Commissioner Jackie Richter-Mengy worked on with the nuclear submarine fleet in terms of sea ice thickness, how deep's the water, and so on. And there are mechanisms to do it. It takes a lot of work, but it's very valuable when it's finally done. And that's it. And so now we will bring to the stage three more commissioners, Commissioner David Kennedy, Commissioner Mark Myers, and Commissioner Kulik Carvalho.
care where we are? There we are.
Well, they didn't drink the other waters. Okay, thank you very much. Same procedure as before. I invite you all to give remarks on the specific goal or cross-cutting theme. And then as time allows, we'll take some questions from the audience. So let's go from Liz and go right up. Thanks.
All right, great. Uvanga koluk kikik minurunga. Ariga, it's good to see you all. My name is Koluk, or Liz Carvalho. I am from Kotzebue, Alaska, which is about 36 miles above the Arctic Circle. And I serve as the Vice President of Lands for NANA in my day job. And so there's a couple of things that I want to touch on specifically on the economics section. And the reason I want to kind of talk a little bit about what I do is because I often think of myself as in between a lot of these different things. I often receive the emails from the Arctic Ocean Observing System program on polar expeditions, and I'm involved in things like working with Kivalina on their master plan for relocation. So there's a lot of things with respect to the work that we do in our organization that are very much related to this question about why economics is so important. And I really want to start even farther back, though, is that we're really not, when I think about Arctic research and Arctic in general and the things that we're talking about today, is this really technically not about today, it's about our future generations. All of the goals that are in the report are integrated, including these economic goals. And I really appreciate Dr. Brigham bringing this topic forward and really talking about it, because if we're supposed to be taking an integrated and holistic approach to the Arctic, like Jim touched on, I think we really do have to consider the economics of the Arctic and the challenges that we're faced. Imagine aiming to focus on economic development in the Arctic, including developing a future workforce, in the face of the image that we saw earlier of water right at someone's doorstep. We have that responsibility to consider what are those opportunities for people who are in the Arctic to remain in the Arctic, but also the Arctic is an international space. I think Inuit people, Inupiaq people, we understand that. We have relatives who are in Russia. We have relatives who are in Greenland and Canada. We're inherently multinational in our families. And so it's a really critical issue. More research is needed to understand what barriers there are to those east-west economies and economic development. We also need to understand what barriers there are to sustainable economic development in the Arctic, and how to ensure that we have reliable data for management of our natural resources. The Arctic is not only a place of great change in the environment, it is also a place where we used to talk about the race to resources and that risk that it poses to our communities. There's a lot of opportunities in this space, but there's a lot of challenges. That race to resources has been underpinned by conversations around critical minerals, as well as oil and gas, and especially fisheries. We really need to be ready to talk about the future of the Arctic economy, not only in Alaska, but globally, and what it means to the future of the Arctic overall. Again, I think focusing on economic research is really critical, and it's important to really treating the Arctic as though it is treating the Arctic holistically and thinking about what it is that we need to do to understand the Arctic and the future of the region overall. Something I really appreciated about the question asked earlier is the topic of natural capital accounting. I think I apologize, I don't remember your name, but the question around what kind of topics were challenging for us. And I know in the international space, natural capital accounting is something that is being looked at as a really great way for us to consider how we balance natural resource development with what kind of things people get from the environment. One of the inherent risks of this is that these processes are not technically including the views of Indigenous people and what natural capital accounting could mean when we try to measure what subsistence actually means to the local people and communities. And so that's definitely a risk and was a tough topic for the Commission overall. I'm going to leave my comments there, and hopefully we'll have a good conversation when we get to questions.
Thank you so much.
So I had cooperation, and I don't know that you noticed, but virtually every speaker has talked about cooperation. And everything I was going to say has been said a couple of times over now. So cooperation is obviously very important, and it is. And so I'll just review the bidding just a little bit. So why is cooperation so important? Well, let's start with the comment that John stole from me, for me. We've been talking 2 times the change in the Arctic, but I think all the data that we're beginning to see shows 3 to 4 times. We're having a hard time keeping up with 2, and now we're at 4. And without everybody pulling together, that cooperation is absolutely required for us to keep some sort of a handle on the dramatic change that's taken place. So that's really important. Then cooperation, what, 2/3 of the Arctic is Russia? We had some communication, some dialogue with Russia and sharing of information and data. We don't really have that anymore. And so all the more reason for those of us that are working in the Arctic outside of Russia to have to work an awful lot harder to coordinate and cooperate, given the change that's taken place. And then the Arctic Council was mentioned. The Arctic Council's on pause. The Council can be a good cooperation coordination unit, and they haven't really been able to do that. So the discussion about now going to Norway as the new chair, we're optimistic that that will help maybe some more dialogue than we've had. I'm hearing there is some sort of a new ambassador at large for the Arctic. And I'm hoping whoever that person becomes can maybe help with that whole issue. I'm pretty sure he can. So just really quickly to review the bidding of where that cooperation is needed. We've talked about whole of government for the U.S. That's something you hear more and more. You've heard about Arctic Executive Steering Committee and NSAR and IARPIC. All those things are really positive drivers, and I won't go into all of it again. You've heard all of those things mentioned. One thing that was just briefly mentioned that some of us are looking forward to helping maybe further understand and coordinate and cooperate on Arctic is this idea of a budget analysis across all the agencies. We don't know where a lot of the money lies, and so as a result, we don't know maybe how to maybe connect dots better than we could. So that analysis is due, what, a year from now, John?
Shorter than that.
Less than that?
Larry and I are sweating.
But whole of government, obviously a lot going on. We have some recommendations, more can be done. International, so we have a number of partners. We have recommendations that have come out, but Canada, for instance, has a lot of work going on. I think there's more we could do with Canada than we have been doing. They have a Polar Institute that we've talked about visiting. There's been some dialogue. I think there could be a lot more with Canada. And it's interesting that a number of folks that in the past have been conducting research in Russia are now moving into Canada to do that same research. So I think there's a lot of stuff we can do there. Greenland, another kind of emerging place with an awful lot of discussion going on about what research can be done there. Europe, a big player for a long time, and they have a lot of money, a lot of money to invest there. So there's that. State of Alaska, John has covered that. I was going to talk about it a little bit, but I think there's more we can do there. This is really, as I understand it, the first time that we've established a dialogue. And as I talk about particular issues, I find that there is a State of Alaska group that's doing that kind of thing that still we're not aware of. So I think there's more we can do with the State of Alaska. And then there's been lots and lots of discussion about Indigenous, and that's another part that I think we're kind of on the front end of, but Indigenous cooperation and engagement and involvement, really essential to all this cooperation working better. So that's it for me.
Great. Thank you. And now our last commissioner, but I want to make sure we leave some time for questions. Okay. All right, I'm going to watch you. Okay.
Well, thank you. Speaking about data might be the most boring, but maybe in some ways the most important part of this discussion.
No, cooperation.
As a geologist, I'd rather be out in the outcrop, but the important part of this is research is an investment. It's an investment that hopefully, which has to compete with other investments, whether it be icebreakers or whether it be infrastructure, whether it be key healthcare issues. So you have to look at what does that investment bring you, and how do you use that investment. And so when we look at the cross-cutting of data, the value of that is how do you apply that information? And as Senator Murkowski said, in a dynamic situation, you skate to the puck. Rather, I would say you skate to where you think the puck's going to be. And that is much more difficult in a very much changing Arctic. So we have a dynamic situation where we have very complex ecosystems, and it's not the Arctic. If you fly over the Arctic in your commercial airline at 30,000 feet, like our report, it takes you hours. You cross mountains, you cross coastal areas with significant rainfall. You cross areas that are basically Arctic deserts. You go from elevations to the tallest elevations in North America to sea level, with an incredible amount of ecosystem diversity and change, and cultural differences and changes, and resource differences and changes. So it's not the Arctic. It's like looking at the eastern half of North America or the western half of North America, in essence. So when you lump it into the Arctic, you oversimplify the issue. So to answer questions, you not only need to know the general trends, as Jackie pointed out, you need to know very specific information about specific ecosystems, specific resources, specific infrastructure issues, which means the data has to be adequate to analyze at a specific level. The good news is we have some tremendous new technology and tools with big data, machine learning, and AI that allow us to start projecting and looking at this future change and skating more to the puck. But the quality of that data really matters. So garbage in, garbage out is a classic IT statement. You can be overconfident in the model if your data is not good and your data is not specific enough. So how do we get that data from the state of the general trends that Jackie was talking about to specific, usable, and complex issues that cross multiple disciplines and multiple spatial domains at different scales and time scales as well? Really difficult in the Arctic, for more difficult in other areas because A, it's expensive to get data, it's remote. The history of the data sets are very, very limited. The quality of the data sets are very variable. We don't have that history you have elsewhere. So we have greater challenges. We have opportunities with new technology, though. There's a tremendous amount of new remote sensing capacity in unmanned aerial vehicles, low-level satellites. But all that data has to be calibrated with real data on the ground. So that is a huge issue. And when we look at that, yes, we can tell you a lot about sea ice, but what can we tell you about ocean water temperature and acidification from 3 or 4 points in an area the size of the U.S. East Coast? You know, how good does that project to give you an actual prediction of what that individual part of the Bering Sea, what might be the core temperatures and issues, and how does it vary? So we're looking at a point where we really need to be able to gather more specific and better quality data and maintain that data. To do so, we need to really encourage the works like SAON and other groups that have really gone to look at basic data sets, GEOS, agencies like the USGS Stream Gauge Network or ocean data from NOAA, critical. But we're sadly missing in terms of the number of sensors we have and the continuity of the data sets. So how do we succumb that? I think we have to make more investment. The recommendation is we need more investment in these specific sites, plan to look at the individual components of the ecosystems, better metadata standards to integrate the data sets in a way, better quality control, and probably the most important, open sourcing many data sets. There are opportunities. We talked about indigenous knowledge. How do we enter indigenous knowledge while protecting the value of that data for the indigenous community, but also using that data? That's a really important piece of this. Other important pieces are there's a lot of data collected by non-governmental agencies, by companies that are searching for a permit. Say you have an oil company in North Slope doing environmental work. Can that data be incorporated? Can it be quality controlled and incorporated? Can it be required to be put into metadata standards that's interoperable with other data sets? Releasability of data that's required because of the permits on federal lands. I'll give you an example, 3D seismic data. 3D seismic data can be confidential for 25 to 50 years. That data has very much value probably for 10 years, but after that, not so much. And that data will allow you not just to look for oil and gas, but allow you to understand the permafrost in a 3-dimensional or 4-dimensional sense. So there are huge data sets out there that are not yet being incorporated into our system that are critical. And it costs a lot of money to do this. And so John's looking at me. That's the pitch. The pitch is to improve this interoperability. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. That was just great. And Mark can, with great enthusiasm and with great interest, go on. And I hope so. I hope we get a question that will give him that opportunity. So let's open up the floor, please.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Kana Achakiak, and I'm from Kotzebue, Alaska, and I'm also a professor at Virginia Tech. I am passionate about data, and in particular, I'm passionate about the access for Indigenous communities for their own self-determined needs to data. So increasing capacities for data analysis, as well as making choices, thinking about Indigenous data sovereignty. And so how, with thinking about increasing data and also economic development that we need to be doing as well in the Arctic, and workforce development like Commissioner Vo was talking about, how do we incorporate Indigenous people's capacity development with using data, analyzing data, and also making choices about data in equitable ways?
You want to go, Liz? Or do you want me to go?
Go for it.
So, we recommend and endorse the FAIR and CARE standards both, and those standards have a bit of contradiction. One is open source, and one is protecting the sources of Indigenous information. Processes to make sure the community and the individuals are accepting the release of that information, or it doesn't get released. So we have to, it's obviously a balance. It's obviously a balance. It's just beginning to be worked out. The second is the decision support tools that need to be developed need to be workable in the communities. Mm-hmm. The visualization, the access to the data sets, the training. Again, as Commissioner Vo talked about, without education and training in the communities, they can't use the tools. So it's a combination of a lot of different efforts, but actionable ability to use the data, I think, and tools that can be used. The data tools are going to be there long before the quality of the data. The danger is if the data is not good, the results in the tools will not be reliable. So trust in the data becomes a critical element, and that requires QA/QC, transparency, and one other thing I didn't talk about is life cycle management of the data sets.
Yeah. If I can add to that question, I really appreciate it, by the way. I think a component of what Commissioner Carlo also talked about around compacting and contracting is that using these types of tools that Commissioner Myers is talking about, if you're working with communities, there's an opportunity for their own driven research, things where they're bringing in folks that they want to do want to do research with or partner with them on is really critical. I think we take that approach in the work that I do of how do we engage our local communities when we talk about resource development, and it is pivotal. It's critical for us to have reliable, trustworthy data to help support decision-making processes when it's about resource development, subsistence, all of those things that intersect. And so I think you're touching on something that's really critical and important, and we definitely talked about as a commission. So, Quayna.
So I had two questions, and I'm going to drop the one about data because we just had a data question. I'll ask my economics question. Mm-hmm. So when I'm thinking about research in economics, I'm thinking that the circumstances in the Arctic are so different from circumstances where standard economic models are built. Like standard economic models don't include a parameter for it costs you $500 to maybe be able to go get a driver's license. Mm-hmm. And they don't account for the very high cost of fuel getting it to some remote place. I mean, for us, it costs us $15 or $20 a gallon to get fuel to Antarctica, for example. And I'm wondering if you folks thought in the economics aspect of your goals about how we should really be thinking about economic models in a very different way than we have been.
All right, I'll try to tackle that. I think in some ways, yes. I'm not a trained economist. I have a master's in organization development, and a lot of the work that we do, we're dealing with those issues. So a good example is we've got in my organization. So a good example that I have is going back to your fuel example is that we've got communities that have no barge access. And people will say, well, how can we get past that? These communities are paying $15 a gallon for fuel right now. And something people are not always aware of is there's only one airplane in the entire state that can deliver fuel to that community because of the restrictions related to safety and the runway. And so I think when it comes to supply chain management, that definitely came up in our conversations, is how do we better understand the supply chain network and how does that impact economic development? How does that impact any sort of activity in the Arctic? People love to talk about Red Dog like it's a really great example. Red Dog is a unique deposit, and the only reason that all the resources come in the way they do is because it is economic. It is worthwhile enough to do that. And there's lots of things like critical minerals in Alaska that are not in that place where they may not be economic because of that. So I don't know that I've answered your question other than to say it has definitely come up in conversation. And I, in particular, I'm very curious about that with respect to onshore and offshore, definitely with respect to maritime as well.
I can address it a little bit with resources. The minimum economic field sizes have to be world-class in many places in the Arctic. And it's, again, not one Arctic. If you're on the coast, very different economics than if you're far in the interior without roads and infrastructure. Baseline data, again, assessment of these resources is critical because these are largely resources on non-public lands, or native-owned lands if they're non-public, or on public lands which are either state or federal. So consequently, again, it's not the private ownership that's driving this, it's the public policy decision about whether to evaluate and develop it or not, in which case those assessments, the fundamental baseline data, usually has to be done by the government, followed by, or by the native corporation, followed by a licensing process, which then goes to development or not development. But it's complicated because the infrastructure that comes in often has a material effect to it. And again, with the environmental uncertainty, the way to develop it without affecting other resources is a huge issue. Again, the tools to look at 35 years out what that environment looks like. What are you building your tailings ponds to? How are you dealing with hydrological issues? The list goes on and on. These are the uncertainties that we deal with. Again, that we need the better data and the better tools for analyzing and predicting probabilistically what those futures might look like. So it's a very difficult process in the Arctic because of that uncertainty, but also because the scale of the developments have to be big, the impact is significant. And we see that play out time and time again.
I wanted to add a little bit more too. I don't think we talked about it too much, but the report does talk a little bit about the impacts of COVID on Arctic research. I think there's a lot of lessons learned in an environment where we don't have broadband in the Arctic. And so when we talk about rollout or economies, it's also those other things that the Arctic can't quite participate in with respect to the rest of the economy. We talk about natural resource or classic economic development because that's predominantly what's available. But those barriers, I think, are really critical to address as well to broadband or other types of communications that impact DoD or DHS operations in the Arctic. Yeah.
I got a signal that we can go a couple more questions, so let's keep going. Okay. I think Shannon and Marisol had their hands up. Is that okay? Sure.
Thanks, John. I'm still trying to untangle if you were calling the Coast Guard a dog in your comments a while ago, but that's not my question.
Never.
So, something Senator Murkowski said about you guys intend to publish some kind of progress report, and then Mark touched on, skating to the puck. One of the things I like to do is look to what I want or what we want the Arctic future to be, and then kind of back that up. What activities do we need to take now, midterm, long-term, to get to that? Looking at your recommendations, have y'all thought about that? What will the Arctic look like if we're successful in achieving those recommendations? Near term, and then longer term, and then what does the Arctic look like if we don't?
Okay, so my question is a follow-up on the economics, because I thought it was interesting, John, that you were saying that you brought in some classically trained economists, knowing that in kind of conventional economics with like a cost-benefit analysis, for instance, there's a lot of externalities and for costs and benefits, right? So like externalizing the costs, which is why we're now dealing with a climate crisis and, biodiversity crisis, but also in terms of things like ecosystem services and natural capital, which was really great that you are including that. So I'm just really curious about kind of how you're kind of reconciling those two approaches towards economics to make sure that maybe a project that is deemed economically viable is really serving the interests of the people and not kind of contributing to the larger issues that we're dealing with. And, you know, kind of, especially when you kind of look at convergence science, right? So anything, you know, especially around like underwater noise and the way that's impacting marine life, which is so important for, you know, for a litany of reasons, right? But I think that's like, you know, looking at that plus the ocean acidification that we're seeing in the Arctic, like how that's kind of being combined to reconcile the approaches.
That's too long a question for me, but go ahead.
Wants to go first?
Well, maybe to the first question, what does the future look like for the Arctic? And again, the Arctic is a big place. And so we have to be a little more specific about what we mean by that. I mean, obviously you have a series of relatively moderate-sized cities, and then you have rural Alaska. Rural Alaska is probably being less resilient in the sense of the amount of erosion, coastal capacity to deal with it, basic infrastructure not being there, having to move whole villages. There's a lot of really serious questions there about how do you do this and how much of that's baked in. But the question is, when you do move, you want to move to a sustainable place that's going to be valid in terms of both community values, but also sustainable ecosystem services for that place. So a lot of questions there. How do you build an economy in the rural areas? I mean, we have great examples like Red Dog where they've really worked through a lot of these issues. So I need to defer to Liz in terms of how you set those values of the mine versus, you know, versus the subsistence lifestyle and the other issues and the jobs and the taxation pieces that go with that. The North Slope Borough, et cetera, with oil and gas has seen a lot of benefits from that. But what happens in the next generation where oil and gas is no longer, 35 years from now, when oil and gas is pretty much done? What does that look like? Is it that hydrogen ammonia economy? Is it gone? And what replaces that in terms of an income stream? Unknown question. So the huge economic questions about what does energy future in the world look like? That dramatically affects the Arctic. Second is the mining part of it can replace some of that, but it won't provide the direct state revenue that oil and gas does. It's simply not as profitable in terms of overall state revenue. So we don't have an answer on the economic side. We don't really have an example of how we're going to manage the ecosystem chain sides. And then, God forbid, we have a major earthquake or other substantial disaster, which probabilistically says we will at some point. How do we handle that? So we have lots of hazards, lots of challenges. The opportunity is really for the state to be forefront in sense of Alaska in terms of building resiliency. And I believe it starts with the education system, quite honestly, that we build capacity in the people ultimately. But there's no crystal ball, I think, out there right now. But we do know that the world economic situation is changing, which creates opportunities and challenges, that the environmental change is going to create a lot more challenges probably than opportunities for us, although some with shipping and some other ones. And we badly need to build the capacity to manage that. And then those investments have to start now. So again, coming back, the crystal ball is cloudy, I think. But the good news is some of these tools, some of this data, this research is paying off in terms of better be able to quantify and predict and make some of those investments now that we know are going to be sustainable. Investments like icebreakers, like port facilities. Mm-hmm. So mm-hmm. I'm talking too much. Liz,
you're good. No, sorry, Commissioner Myers. Those are both really great questions. And I think I tried to start out in my comments was, when we talk about the Arctic and everything that we're talking about right now, we're not talking about us right now. We are talking about future generations. So to me, I always feel like I'm walking this line between trying to explain how critical it is that it's not subsistence versus natural resource development. It's really about how can these two things coexist and how do we have the right information and data for decision makers, for the people on the ground to decide whether or not they want to participate in that. And we're also recognizing, and this may not be a very popular opinion, that if we treat the Arctic as though it is a park that needs to be preserved, we are risking causing communities the inability to have economies, especially without any sort of broadband or other alternatives to participate in the economy. Most communities do not have a tax base unless they have a large natural resource development project. And Mark is correct. Our borough's budget, where the Red Dog Mine is situated in the Northwest Arctic Borough, is about 10% the size of the North Slope budget because of oil and gas development on the North Slope. And the mine itself only has about 8 years left on it. So what does that actually mean for our communities, and how do we get ready for the next phase of economic development in our region? So there's a lot of emphasis and focus on getting the workforce ready to do more with respect to renewable energy. What other potential mineral resources are out there that can coexist with subsistence? So I don't know that I'm answering your question, but I think it is really important that the need for good data is critical. The ability to be agile and flexible in considering what is the next move is really important and adaptive. Because it's just, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think there's a lot of opportunity in the Arctic, not only in Alaska, but across the entire Arctic. I think we miss a lot of opportunities in potential east-west connections. How could we better partner with our northern Canadian communities to have thriving economies and workforces? So to me, when I think about what could the Arctic look like, what would it be in the future, I think it's what can we do to foster those east-west connections, and how do we get the workforce ready to do that? And then how are we building the systems that really help us monitor what's going on in the Arctic so we can continue to get information and help folks with decision-making processes.
Great, thank you so much. And so with that, thank you very much to this panel. And now call our chair back up for some very brief concluding remarks. Thank you.
Let's get out of here. Just ask some questions.
Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, John. My very brief closing comments will be this. Now you know who these commissioners are and what they bring to the fore. You've heard a lot of work that you've been working on. In some cases, we've tried to amplify and enable what you're doing. In other places, we've tried to fill the gaps. In all facets of our work, we try to advance the Arctic. We've tried to understand what the contours are right now. That's the discovery many of you are trying to make for us. And we've tried to inform and influence what the contours, Shannon, of the Arctic will look like. Obviously, nobody has those answers. There's so much change going on so quickly. That's why I started out my remarks with saying there's a sense of urgency. And it's not just about wanting, to have a goal to roll out a report sometime. It's that many of us live there. Many of us are impacted by what's happening in the Arctic, not just the state of Alaska. And so this, in some, I think, very good way, is just one piece. This, I mean, the report and the commission, one piece of all of you who are working on these issues every day. That Venn diagram that Dr. Hinsman laid out, if it put all of our logos on there, it would fill the screen. And we are just one part of that. So I hope that you have seen the work that the commissioners have done, the fantastic staff. I mean, John Farrell, Cheryl Rosa, I could keep going, that brought our ideas together, shed many of them to get us focused, but those others ones won't go away. And in some way, as the senator noted, we've tried to make the report digestible, actionable, accessible, and again, complement, enable, and enhance what you're doing each and every day. So we thank you for spending time with us, allowing us to tell you about our work. We hope that you'll follow the work, and I hope that you will contact these commissioners and Dr. Farrell and Dr. Rosa, make them a part of your work as well. I know their cell phones are full every day with calls from you and others from around the world, not just our own country. And that's part of the commission's work, is to help you do what you do so that we have better understanding about the Arctic well into the future. So with all of that, thank you very much for spending 4 hours with us today, going over the 2023-2024 goals and objectives of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. Thank you.